first of all, give you a great big welcome. My name is June Crown. I've had the privilege of being president of MedAct for some years and have been involved with it for even longer. And I can't tell you how thrilling it is to see such a wonderful group of people here today. And I'm just going to start the proceedings with a few housekeeping, one of which is to remind you to turn off your mobile phones. I think the exits are well identified, and as far as I know, they're not expecting a fire drill today, so that's, or a fire, I hope. And there are just a couple of changes to the programme. Ben Goldacre, unfortunately, is not going to be able to be with us. That's in this afternoon. And Celine Tan is going to be replaced, I think, by David McCoy. As you'll be aware, the logistics of this meeting are mildly complicated, but the rain, I gather, is not coming till the afternoon, so it will be reasonably easy to go to and fro to the refreshment areas. But as you will all be aware, we've got a very tight timetable, so I think it's very important that everybody does do their very best to get back on time so that we can benefit from the incredible array of speakers and discussion topics that we're going to be addressing. Also, could you just identify where the locations are for the parallel sessions this afternoon? And again, come back rapidly from those. And the chairs of the sessions, please be very brutal about ensuring that we do that, because I think that's how we shall all get the most out of the day. We have a lot of very impressive people here, both the speakers, the audience, lots of long-standing members of MedAct, some people who I think are not members of MedAct, and it's particularly exciting to see so many of the younger medicine participants, and I think all of us will benefit from the discussions from these very different perspectives. And particularly happy to be able to welcome one rather special guest from abroad, Dr. Lars Pohlmeier, who's the chairman of the IPPN board and European vice president for the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is the body to which we're affiliated, and a former Nobel Prize winner. So we have a lot of breadth of experience with us. As you know, most of you, MedAct has been in existence for a very long time, and it has been very exciting since David took over as chairman and the board has been reviewing the activities, that we are now in a position to have a meeting like this to help the board to identify the priorities and the ways forward for MedAct. Those of you that have been involved will know that the name has changed over the years from an organisation that was almost solely involved with the prevention of nuclear war and issues around nuclear weapons, to take on much broader aspects of global security. And there are many opportunities now to take that forward if we can identify the resources. We've certainly got the energy, and I think this seems to me to be a wonderful moment to really have a surge forward, as it were. As somebody who's not been involved in the hard work of MedAct, as it were, I can express pride in the work that has been done. I mean, it seems rather inappropriate for an organisation like this, but it certainly punches above its weight. And the documents, the influence that it has had, I think, has been way beyond what would normally come from a small organisation. And I have always felt a great sense of pride in my association with that and with the work that has been done by a very, very small staff, but a lot of very dedicated members who have put time, energy, expertise into raising our profile and maintaining our credibility and our integrity. So I'm not going to stop any longer, but I do want to introduce, first of all, Andy Haynes, who I'm sure is very well known to very many of you as a former director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Andy is really going to set the scene and the context for the issues that we think are relevant to the future activities of MedAct. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, June. My first question, I guess, is can you actually see the slides? Yes, I just was, when we were sitting there, I was realizing that might be a problem. Is there any way we can turn down some of the very bright lighting at the front so people can see the slides? Is that better? Good. Okay, so what I'm going to do, as June has said, is I'm going to really give an outline of the sort of big picture of why MedAct is needed now more than ever. I'm going to say something about some of the challenges that have confronted global health over recent years. There has been significant progress, but there are very, very major unresolved challenges. And I'm also going to talk about some of the big environmental issues that are with us today, but are coming very rapidly over the horizon to figure very largely in coming decades, and will very much shape, I think, the future of humanity. So there are these interlinked issues of poverty, inequalities, problems with global environmental change, particularly climate change, but not just climate change, militarization, the remaining threat of nuclear weapons, and it's probably just by good fortune, actually, that a nuclear weapon has not been detonated in error. There have been several accidents which have come very, very close to a nuclear weapon being detonated, and of course, as we know, even more worryingly, to nuclear conflict. So it's these interrelated challenges, I believe, that will define the coming decades, the rest of the century and beyond, and also pose a very important agenda for MedAct. Well, first of all, what about progress? We've seen really quite substantial progress. We have seen major progress in reducing under-5 mortality, some progress in maternal mortality, substantial increase in the coverage of antiretrovirals and for HIV/AIDS, improvements in the management of TB, malaria, and so on. So there have been serious improvements, but there are many challenges remaining, and there's only 2 years, of course, before the Millennium Development Goals should be achieved, and about 37 countries around the world are showing insufficient progress to achieve those goals in child health, and for about 18 countries, all of them in Africa, there's essentially no really substantial progress. So despite these gains, despite the fact we have many more effective interventions, despite the fact that health programs have been scaled up in many countries, there are still many steps to be taken in order to reduce child, maternal, adult mortality to levels that are acceptable in a civilized world. We're also seeing that with population growth, and of course the most recent projections suggest, the UN projections suggest perhaps 10 billion people on the planet by the end of the century, that even where we have achieved Millennium Development Goals, for example, in terms of urban slums, there have been 100 million people. That goal has been achieved of moving people out of slum conditions. In fact, it's over 200 million people. But because of population growth and also migration, the absolute number of slum dwellers has increased from nearly 800 million in 2000 to well over 800 million in 2010. So we've got to run fast just to keep up with population growth. Population growth is declining in many parts of the world, but it's still very high in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and that in itself provides a challenge to health and well-being. We have seen some improvements in income poverty. So, for example, if you look between 1990 and 2010, there's been a reduction in the number of people living in absolute poverty from just under 2 billion to 1.2 billion, something of that order. But when you look at the slightly higher level, let's say $2 a day, progress is much less clear. So there's been relatively little change since 1981. And if we looked at $3 to $5 a day, which is probably the minimum acceptable level, then we would also see even less progress. So again, some progress with absolute poverty, but inequalities are increasing, and many people remain mired in poverty. And one of the other phenomena that's been very obvious over the last decade or so is the growth in illicit financial flows. These illicit financial flows essentially are controlling, they are out with many of the controls of countries, so countries are powerless in many cases to stop these flows of resources. And if we look at the lost taxes that would accrue from these illicit financial flows, they would exceed the value of overseas development assistance by several fold. And you can see on this slide the illicit financial flows in the light blue, which are increasing dramatically, and the overseas development assistance. So the illicit financial flows over $1 trillion a day. So that is indeed an alarming trend, and a trend which is outside the control of national governments, and for which there is no effective global governance mechanism. As the Commission on Social Determinants of Health suggested, this is an alarming state of affairs when there's a net financial outflow from poorer to richer countries. And they further stated structural inequities in the global institutional architecture maintain unfairness in trade-related processes and outcomes. So what we're seeing, for example, is that subsidies to farmers in wealthy countries, again, vastly exceed overseas development assistance. And although those subsidies are coming down, they're still very high, unacceptably high, and distorting international trade. So often we see a dual standard, whereby poor countries are expected to liberalise their economies, whereas rich countries can continue to erect trade barriers and subsidies. Global wealth inequality is higher than the wealth equality of any individual country. So the top 5% of individuals take 71% of global wealth, and very strikingly, the bottom half take 1%. So dramatic inequalities, and they're probably even greater than that. Some work done, even the CIA, for example, the CIA report has demonstrated the inequalities of wealth and how the mega-rich have grown. And some of the work on tax evasion and offshore tax havens has shown that if you include this illicit financial flows, then the disparities are even greater. So 1/14 of 1% of the world's population own 84% of total global personal financial wealth, according to these kind of estimates. And just over 1,000 individuals have more wealth than the total GDP of South America, Latin America, and Africa. So these are quite extraordinary and unsustainable disparities, and quite unacceptable, I think, as well as, I think, being undermining of security. At the same time, we've seen an expansion of debt. If you look back in the middle of the century, in the post-war reconstruction period, of course, debt as a percentage of GDP was well over 100%, as is shown in this slide from the IMF data. It then fell in the post-war period as economies expanded, countries paid off their national debt, and then it started to climb again in the 70s and 80s with structural adjustment programs, which were trying to limit this debt, but also posed great impacts, negative impacts on health and education. And then it's gradually increased and accelerated in the last few years by the banking bailouts. So we've had, the public sector has had to bail out the banks for their failures in governance and management of their resources. So the costs of the financial crisis are only recently becoming apparent. It's been suggested that the total bank bailouts might be as high as $9 trillion, with an added stimulus of perhaps nearly $2.5 trillion, and emergency loans of $1 trillion. So really quite extraordinary financial expenditure needed in order to subsidize the banks, to get them out of the hole which they have dug themselves in. And it's been suggested that the recessionary effects and the lost global economic income of around $4 trillion annually, which is expected to persist for many years, is likely to accumulate over time and have a very major impact on the prospects, particularly of the poor. And these are probably conservative figures. They don't include all the data. So we've already seen some health and social consequences of the crisis in Europe and the US, for example, thanks to the work of Martin McKee, David Stuckler, and Sanjay Basu and others, a number of other researchers. They've demonstrated that suicides have increased as a result of the crisis. In Greece, for example, they've increased by more than 60% since 2007. And they've also demonstrated that progressive policies, labour market policies, can help to reduce some of these negative effects. But obviously, they become difficult when public budgets are tightly capped. And there's already evidence that there's increased infant deaths in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of cutbacks, and increase in out-of-pocket expenditure on health. So a number of health impacts of the crisis are still being documented, and undoubtedly they will have repercussions over coming years and decades. And what's extraordinary really is that, as pointed out by this UNCTAD document a couple of years ago, those who support fiscal tightening argue it's indispensable for restoring the confidence of financial markets, which is perceived as key to economic recovery. But this is despite the almost universal recognition that the crisis was the result of financial market failure in the first place. So we're actually supporting the mechanisms which have led us into this crisis. And of course there are various attempts to reform the financial sector, but I think most observers feel they're not sufficient. And it certainly doesn't look as though the necessary reforms have been put in place. It's also important to point out that despite the fact that the Cold War is long ended, world military expenditure has plateaued. It went up until about 2007, 2008 or so, and as you can see on the left side of this slide, it's now plateaued at around about just over $1.5 trillion a year. And there's the famous quote by President Eisenhower, which is on this slide: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone, it is spending the sweat of its labourers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children." So I think couldn't have really said it better than that. And that illustrates, I think, why this continuing diversion of resources is essential for us to resolve if we are to advance public health. And of course it quite dwarfs overseas development assistance. But at the same time as these threats, which are in many ways reasonably familiar to many of us, there are also new threats which are currently beginning to erode some of the life support systems on which human survival ultimately depends, but will have much higher profile in years to come. If you look at estimates of the global ecological footprint, in other words, the space that we require in order to generate the natural resources for us to have healthy and sustainable lives, then if we were to live like the citizens of North America, we would require 5 planet Earths. If we were to live like the average citizen of Western Europe, we would require nearly 3 planet Earths, and so on. It is only parts of the Asia Pacific and Africa which are really living at a sustainable level in the long term. So we have a double challenge, I think. One is to address some of the inequalities that I've already mentioned, but the second is to ensure that human development takes place within environmental boundaries. And a very important paper in Nature a few years ago that you should read if you haven't, by Johan Rockstrom and colleagues, talks about how humanity is breaching planetary boundaries. These planetary boundaries, they suggest there are 9 planetary boundaries, and they suggest that 3 of those are already breached. That is biodiversity loss because of unprecedented species destruction, the nitrogen cycle because we're adding a lot of nitrogen compounds to ecosystems to stimulate agricultural productivity, and climate change, of course, due to the emission of greenhouse gases, largely as a result of our dependence on fossil fuels, but also, of course, because of land clearance and food and agriculture demands. What we don't know much about is how these different trends interact with each other. So there's lots of people studying climate change, but not many people are studying how climate change interacts with, say, ocean acidification or eutrophication of the environment due to excessive use of nitrogen or biodiversity loss. So it's these combination of global environmental threats which I think does pose such a challenge to humanity and which is being not addressed sufficiently. Ocean acidification will be important because as carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, it makes it more acid, of course, and that affects the food chain, it affects the shellfish, and at the moment we don't know what effect that will have on the food supplies of perhaps 1 billion people that depend on marine ecosystems. That's just one example. So there are non-linear effects, there may be surprises ahead, there may be synergies, and there are a number of drivers. Consumption patterns, population growth, although of course poor people consume much less than rich people and cause much less environmental damage in general. Nevertheless, poor people have aspirations in many cases to live a kind of Western high consumption lifestyle, and this will have implications for future environmental impacts. So more and more we have to put health in an ecosystem framework and acknowledge that the fundamental basis of human health depends on the ecosystems of our small planet, with an increasing population and increasing appetite for consumer goods and the consumption of resources. And one symptom of that, of course, is global carbon dioxide emissions. This slide just shows you the emissions per region from fossil fuel use and cement production. And what you can see is that these have gone up very substantially, even since 1990. You can see with that purple, the purple bit in the middle here is China, and you can see how dramatically China's emissions have gone up. Of course, per capita, they're still a lot lower than the US, but because of the size of the Chinese population, it's very substantial on a global scale. Per capita, of course, if you look historically, it's the USA, the UK, and other industrialized countries that have emitted vastly more on a per capita basis. But the emerging economies are contributing an increasing proportion. There's no sign really of them going down. The most recent data just come in a few weeks ago from the last year does suggest the rate of increase might be tapering off. If that's maintained, it could be a good sign, of course. It may be a sign that low carbon technologies are beginning to penetrate. But we cannot be complacent, because I heard the other day there are something like 1,200 coal-fired power stations being planned to be constructed in years to come. So if that's going to happen, then that's going to push us well beyond these boundaries even further. So what effects is this having on climate? This is just taken from the most recent IPCC report. Of course, there are some very vociferous skeptics. Everyone's skeptical of it. Science is organized skepticism. Nothing wrong with skepticism, but when it's unbalanced skepticism, then it can be very damaging. But this just really summarizes in a nutshell the scientific consensus about climate change. The top part of the slide just shows you the annual average temperature. And if you're a climate change skeptic, what you say, if you're the Daily Mail or so on, you say, well, look, climate change has stopped. It hasn't increased over the last 15 years. Yeah, well, we had a big El Nino in 1998, and El Nino is a natural phenomenon, but it added on to the warming effect. And if you look at the decadal average, because climate fluctuates for natural reasons, you can see that the decadal average is clearly going up. And if you look at many of the other indicators, we look at Arctic sea ice, if you look at glacier melting, it's all going, and if you look at sea temperature in the upper part of the ocean, it's very clear where the heat's going. It's going to the upper part of the ocean. So there's not really doubt that climate change is happening. We don't know exactly from year to year how it will pan out. There's always going to be variability in the system. And if we look at the overall observed change in average temperature, you can see that over the last century or so, you can see purple is over 1.5 degrees. There's been substantial warming in parts of the world, and many parts of the world have experienced warming over 1 degree. On average, it's about 0.8 degrees. And the real concern then is that we're actually moving towards a much hotter world indeed. And the World Bank, in its recent report, Turn Down the Heat, has summarized some of the estimates and suggested that there could be a 40% chance of a 4 degree centigrade rise in temperature from pre-industrial era by 2100. I mean, that's an extraordinary increase. And that's well beyond the bounds that many climatologists think are potentially could trigger very dangerous climate change. And they put that threshold around about 2 degrees, where you might get very large-scale melting of ice caps and so on and so on. So we're heading for a very hot future, a very bleak future, unless we radically cut greenhouse gas emissions. And at the present, there's no sign we're going to do that. This will have a range of impacts on health. I don't have time to go into them, but just to give you a few headlines. The summers in the late part of this century will be warmer than the warmest on record. And on this slide, you can see where 90% of the summers the later part of the century will be warmer than the warmest on record. At a certain point, you get to kind of maximum tolerable thermal stress, where you can't work. I mean, already parts of the world, it's difficult to work in the summer months. We know labour productivity is affected. Obviously, as the temperature warms, labour productivity is affected even more, will drive more people into poverty, reduce agricultural productivity. And if we go above 7 degrees, you actually get to a situation which calls the habitability of some parts of the world into question. In fact, probably even before we get there. 2010 was just one example. You can't say a single event's due to climate change. You can only say that climate change increases the probability of certain events, but climate events were very striking in 2010. We had the Pakistan floods, the Chinese floods. Between them displaced 30 million people. The Russian drought resulted in a reduction in the wheat harvest by 30%. They stopped exporting. Many observers have linked that to the political disturbances in North Africa because of the increase in bread prices. And there were large numbers of deaths in Moscow and Western Russia due to the extreme heat. And there were record temperatures in 17 countries. There's a global water crisis. That would probably be happening if we didn't have climate change, but climate change will accelerate it. Water scarcity is growing because we're depleting aquifers in many parts of the world. And in about a decade or so, more than half the world's population is projected to live under conditions of severe water stress. And importantly for MEDACT, of course, it could be a trigger for conflict, because we know that 270 or so major transboundary watersheds cross the territories of over 140 countries. And this could be a trigger for conflict. And this will affect irrigation, and we've already seen the loss of many wetlands. If we look ahead, climate change is likely to have effects on food production. In the early years, the next few decades, we may see increases in food production in northern latitudes, but likely to see decreases in tropical and subtropical latitudes, as shown in this slide from the UN Development Programme, where they've summarised some of the modelled changes in cereal grain yields to the mid-century. So although you look at overall food production for the next few decades, it doesn't look too bad. It ignores the fact that the distribution is really going to affect very heavily the growing populations in Africa in particular. And I think there's no reason to imagine that rich countries are going to export their grain to poor countries when they're needed, because that's not effectively happening very much at the moment. And there are many other factors that will add to this, also illustrated here, which are not taken into account in these climate models, so it could be a great deal worse. So the rhetoric from some quarters has been, okay, well, climate change is happening, and even those people who were denying that it was happening a few years ago, I think, are saying, well, yes, okay, it may be happening, but it's just too expensive to do anything about it. So we'll just carry on as we are. And Lord Stern, Nick Stern, some years ago in the Stern Review, looked at this, and although his findings were disputed by some economists, I think the overall headline message has been accepted by many. And that is, yes, there would be slight increased costs. It does cost money to shift your energy system, to shift to less polluting fuels. But it's a fairly small proportion of the global GDP. And at the maximum, it might delay economic growth by 1 year over the next few decades. So they're relatively small impacts. So these don't take into account the fact that if we move towards a low-carbon economy, there'll be lots of benefits. And these often aren't taken fully into account in these economic models. And a lot of the work I've been involved with in recent years is really trying to document the health, what we call co-benefits, ancillary benefits, of moving towards a low-carbon economy. So you can make a case for moving towards a low-carbon economy even if there wasn't climate change. For example, coal combustion produces a lot of fine particulate air pollution. That kills a lot of people, as do road emissions from road transport. And what we've been doing is to show that there are policies in a whole range of sectors, and we published them in the series in The Lancet a few years ago, and we're doing more work in this area, to demonstrate the extent of the benefits from moving towards low-carbon technologies in the electricity generation sector. This is solar concentrating power. You could generate enough power for the whole world in a small proportion of the world's deserts, if you put up this solar concentrating technology into deserts. Transport through more active travel in cities and low emission vehicles. You could reduce many deaths from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, many other conditions which are related to physical inactivity. Poor people, as I say, don't produce much greenhouse gas emissions, but one thing they do is to, because of poverty, their household energy involves very inefficient combustion of fuels, either biomass or coal. And that produces an enormous amount of indoor air pollution, which kills over 3.5 million people, particularly women and children. But also the black carbon and other pollutants contributes to global warming. So better cook stoves can save lives and reduce climate change. And transforming our food and agriculture, perhaps the most difficult thing to do, tackling some of our consumption patterns, overconsumption of animal products, for example, which is driving some of the NCD epidemic, moving us towards healthier, low-carbon diets could also contribute both to health and to sustainability. So with all this evidence, why are there barriers to policy change? Why aren't we seeing more action? Well, there's a great book which I would recommend to any of you who are interested, called The Merchants of Doubt by two American historians, Oreskes and Conway. And what they've done is to document the kind of history of how really a very small number of scientists, many of them not specialists in either in public health or in environmental issues, as they say, obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. And what's very striking about some of the arguments they make is that some of the institutions, so-called think tanks and so on, particularly in the US, but some in the UK, who have been working on issues like tobacco, saying years ago tobacco was not harmful, trying to denigrate and undermine the science of tobacco and public health, are the same institutions that have been also trying to undermine the science on global warming. And this has, I think, led to confusion amongst the public about the relative importance of climate change. It feeds into the political short-termism of decision makers who are concerned at the next election. And it's made a widespread misapprehension that the change is expensive and difficult. It is expensive. There would be some difficulties. There will be barriers. But it is technically possible, technologically possible. And we need the political leadership to put that into action. So let me now conclude with the final part of the talk, which really brings us back to the original reason that those of you who were at the first meeting of the medical campaign against nuclear weapons, I think it was 1982 or something like that, joined the medical campaign, which is nuclear weapons. And MCA&W, in conjunction with the international umbrella organization, IPPNW, was very successful in demonstrating that the health impacts of nuclear weapons could not be addressed by health services, by health professionals, and that the only way forward was prevention. And I think the world was kind of lulled into a false sense of security by the collapse of communism, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. Much of the public believes that the nuclear weapons issue has gone away, and it hasn't, of course. Nuclear weapons stockpiles, still around 17,000 around the world, most, but not all, in Russia and the US. And the other extraordinary statistic is that 1,800 of these weapons are still on hair trigger alert. So they're still being maintained. They could be launched within a very short time. There doesn't seem to be any rational reason for maintaining them in that way. It's obviously extremely hazardous. It could lead to a nuclear war by accident. And the arguments, I think, for taking them off this hair trigger alert, I think, are overwhelming, but so far have not been heeded. We've seen proliferation. We've seen countries like North Korea and so on, Israel, Pakistan, India, all acquire nuclear weapons. And the other, I think, observation of scientific work over the last few years that's demonstrated why it's so important to address nuclear weapons is that in addition to the effects that we saw at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they have much wider effects as well. And in the 1980s, the phenomenon of nuclear winter became widely known. It was accepted, really, that if you detonated thousands of nuclear weapons, you would drive the world into a nuclear winter with plunging temperatures for many, many years. It wasn't realized until a few years ago that you could achieve a similar and still devastating effect with the explosion of much smaller numbers of nuclear weapons. So scenario modeling over recent years has shown that there could be profound climatic consequences of regional nuclear war. For example, between India and Pakistan, 50 weapons exploded on either side. So the nuclear explosions would ignite fires that burn whole cities. The soot would be lofted high into the atmosphere, absorbing incoming sunlight. And there would be a dramatic decrease in the amount of light reaching the surface of the Earth, causing large and rapid drops in surface temperature, as demonstrated on this slide by Alan Robock, who's led a lot of, by the way, led a lot of the research in this area. And this slide just shows you the climate change that we're being exposed to up to now, which is about 0.8 degrees. And what would happen if 100 of these weapons were detonated? We might see an almost immediate reduction in temperature, perhaps maintained for over a decade, which would devastate agricultural productivity, resulting in a decline in available food, increase in food prices, making food inaccessible to hundreds of millions of the world's poorest. And another striking fact is that the world's grain stores are only sufficient for about 60 to 80 days. So if we suddenly stopped producing enough grain to feed the world, we wouldn't have long to sort out the problem. And it's striking, really, that we keep such small grain reserves, despite the relatively low costs of maintaining them. So there have been, I think, some really positive developments over the last year or so, and some of that's been as a result of IPPNW, medical activities around nuclear war, which have now been taken up by the ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which have acknowledged the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And thanks to the government of Norway, who convened a meeting last March, attended by 128 states and other organizations, there's a whole movement now by a very large number of non-nuclear weapon states to develop a consensus around the need to work towards, very rapidly, nuclear abolition, because that's not happening through the conventional channels, through the NPT, for example. So that process needs to be re-energized. The Health Voice will play a very important role in that. And even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a joint statement at the UN General Assembly putting the case for nuclear weapons to be tackled as an urgent humanitarian issue. So what I've tried to do is to kind of set the scene, to illustrate to you why MedAct is needed now more than ever, why, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of progress in our knowledge, in our ability to improve health, we are still stuck with very major and unacceptable inequalities in health and wealth, and we have these burgeoning crises coming over the horizon very rapidly to confront us, at the same time as the unresolved issues like nuclear weapons that need to be solved urgently if we're to protect humanity in the future. So MedAct is needed to address these interlinked crises. It's needed to rebut some of the attacks on evidence and on science by special interests, promoting particular points of view which are satisfying specific interests, specific commercial interests, and putting health at the very heart of development where it should be. So we need to think and question the current model of development, which is clearly unsustainable, and make a strong and united voice for putting health at the heart of development for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was an absolutely masterly account of the context and the challenges that we and the whole world faces. And it's now my pleasure to introduce David McCoy, who is the current chairman of MedAct, to set out some of the ways in which we, as MedAct and the developing and future MedAct, are going to be able to look at and identify the priorities in taking our contribution to resolving these things. David.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And let me start by saying a few words of thanks. First of all, to Andy for providing us with this overview of the interconnected crises related to economic impoverishment and immiseration, the failure, I think, worldwide to really properly address poverty, although we've seen reductions in extreme poverty. If we were to measure poverty at any reasonable level, the number of people living in poverty, both as a proportion of the world population and in absolute numbers, has actually increased. The threat of climate change and the way in which climate change not only threatens the integrity of our ecosystems, but also it's a threat multiplier for a whole range of other health threats. The potential for climate change to provoke greater conflict, greater violence, greater terrorism. And then finally, also the issue of militarization and how this may affect not just an increase in levels of conflict and the frequency of wars, but also threaten the ways in which we address these problems in a democratic and just manner. So Andy, you've brought to us a range of crises, all of which have health implications. And I guess for us as a health community, there's a reason why we need to be looking at these issues. It's not just to address the health effects of these crises, and perhaps also to mitigate the health problems that emanate from these crises. But I think one of the things that MEDAC sees is a requirement for the health community to also address the underlying root causes. The failure to address climate change effectively and adequately, the failure to reduce military expenditure, the failure to lift people out of poverty, the continued growth in disparities between rich and poor. These all represent social and political failures. And while we can respond as a health community to the health effects of these crises, I think MEDAC sees a requirement for the health community to address these social and political failings at their root cause. And so what are the underlying social and political pathologies that drive war, that lead to ecological destruction, injustice and immiseration? I think it's useful to think about a set of three underlying social pathologies. These are themes that will be explored in some detail in the rest of the day. But the issue of inequality, which Andy has touched on, it's no longer just a moral and ethical issue. And it's not just a consequence of social and political failings that we have and see inequalities in health, inequalities in access to healthcare. I think we're at a stage now where inequalities are also a cause of social and political dysfunction. We have an unprecedented concentration of wealth and power that now underlies a whole raft of policies and laws across a whole range of sectors that are simply bad for the planet and simply bad for most people in this world. But these laws and policies continue because they serve a wealthy and powerful minority. I don't know if Richard Wilkinson or Kate Pickett are here today, but the empirical evidence and theories that they and others have begun to generate to show that inequality is in and of itself a cause of social and political dysfunction, in and of itself a cause for poor health, needs to be taken seriously as a tangible and scientific issue. This is a picture that I use when I teach students on the social determinants of health and the social inequalities of health. And I think it illustrates, I get the students to ask, well, what is the consequence? What are the social, political, and health consequences of this kind of picture, of such stark inequalities at a local level? But whether it's at the local level or the international level, we need to understand how inequality affects the erosion of trust, how it encourages corruption, how it undermines peaceful cooperation, how it creates insecurity in and of itself. And I think we've reached a situation now where inequality has reached crisis proportions. It is an inequality in power and wealth that is really not just, that is really now a social pathology that is driving many of the other crises that are affecting health. Running alongside this crisis of inequality is really a crisis of democracy, and I see this as being the second social pathology that we need to address. And this is in spite of a worldwide growth in the number of representative democracies. So how is it that we've got a greater number of countries that are ostensibly democratic, but seemingly we're in a state of democratic failure, democratic failings? Individual and corporate elites have developed a variety of mechanisms to circumvent democracy. And in the afternoon sessions, we're going to be discussing and talking about some of the mechanisms by which, for example, the corporate sector have been able to capture public policy, the way in which elites have been able to capture politics, either through the financing of politicians or political parties, through the creation of a vast lobbying industry, through the indirect influence over the political process, through the capture of news and information outlets, or by the control of dissent, whether it's done through force or the control of dissent through the creation of personal debt, which has a chilling effect on people's willingness to participate politically, or whether we are also controlling dissent through the use, selective use, strategic use of philanthropy and charity. And the circumvention of democracy has also been facilitated by a form of globalization that has empowered elites, that has empowered multinational corporations, often at the expense of ordinary citizens and national parliaments. So if inequality is a structural pathology, and if our democratic failings represent a political pathology, I think it's useful to consider neoliberalism as the ideological pathology that we need to confront. The theories and ideas of neoliberalism, those that promote a belief in markets, deregulation, small government, and private property rights, are one thing. But whatever we might think about the optimum balance between markets and the state, or between private and public ownership, or indeed between private liberty and the common good, I think we need to understand neoliberalism as a political program that justifies and enables the growth in inequalities that we've seen and this huge concentration of power and wealth that now exists across the world. How else does one explain this ludicrous the ludicrous situation that is encapsulated by these two images? And neoliberalism has gone from being a set of theories and ideas to increasingly becoming some form of meta-ideology, and one that supersedes all other alternatives to the way in which society can and should be organized. And it seems to have even dulled us into thinking that there are no choices but to subscribe to the form of neoliberal, consumer-led, consumption-based society that we exist in, competitive and individualistic in its nature. I was reading a book by Mark Fisher, who I think coined a very stark and startling phrase when he said that we've got to a point where it seems as though it's actually easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of neoliberal capitalism. So part of what I'm trying to do is to really build on what Andy has talked about, which is that these crises related to climate change, the crises related to war, conflict, and militarization, the economic crises related both to continued poverty and immiseration, but also this growth in wealth inequalities, not only interconnect with each other and threaten to create a vicious cycle. And with climate change, it's a vicious cycle that really does threaten not just the health of the poor, but the future health of humanity itself. But that they all share a set of common social and political pathologies. And MedAct is an organization that seeks to harness the voice, the mandates of health professionals to address these underlying social and political pathologies. And I hope I don't sound too radical when I talk like this, because I know I have been labeled as such. But in reality, I'm actually a very mild and moderate person. And I feel like all I'm doing is merely reacting to the facts on the ground. But if these are the social and political pathologies that we face, what are the corresponding vaccines and treatments for these pathologies? I'd like to begin with hope and courage. I know that when I talk to my students and when I talk to my colleagues about climate change, when you actually start to look at the science of the potential effects of runaway climate change and the dangers that are inherent in global warming at 2 degrees, which is a level of global warming that I think we cannot avoid now, it is truly frightening. And you begin to feel a sense of actual hopelessness. And I think there is a large degree of apathy in the public that is driven by a sense of disempowerment and hopelessness. So I think hope is going to have to be one of the vaccines and treatments that we inject into the public if we are to address these underlying social and political pathologies. And courage is the other, because if we are to truly confront malign power, if we are to truly confront the corruption of science, the corruption of politics, the undermining of democracy, courage is going to be required. And there are many examples of doctors and other health professionals who exhibit courage and who provide us with a source of inspiration and motivation. And this is just one person, one of my heroes, Dr. Binayak Sen, who was incarcerated by the state for his work in improving the health of tribal peoples in India. Knowledge and understanding is going to be an important aspect of our treatment of these pathologies. Certainly if we were to deny the power of false propaganda and the spin and the untruths that so many people in the public are exposed to, we're going to have to think about how we can not just create knowledge, but transmit it and communicate it to a wider public. We're going to need imagination if we're to believe that another world is possible. We're going to need imagination if we're going to be able to imagine a world, a low-carbon world, an alternative to the consumption-based world that we currently live in. We're going to need organization if we're to be effective in making change happen. And like I say, we need a bit more public health to harness the critical tools of epidemiology, of rigorous analysis, all of which I think are vital to support the campaign and the work that's required to effect real change. So, all of which brings me to MedAct. June's already talked a little bit about the history of MedAct. Grew out of the medical peace movement from as far back as 1952. It has a strong legacy as an organization that has punched above its weight, but MedAct is still a small organization. A staff of only 2.2 people, full-time equivalent. It's got an office in London, an income of only about 110,000 a year. Much of that income is independent. 95% of it comes from membership subscriptions and private donations. And this conference, this relaunch conference here, is all about looking to see how we can revitalize MedAct, how we can grow and build the organization. And the reason why we want to do this is because we feel that there is a need for an organization of health professionals to act upon these upstream determinants of health and to approach health from a social and political perspective. Specifically, to harness the expertise, mandate, and social standing of this community. In revitalizing MedAct, we're going to continue with having a broad agenda. We're setting up 4 discrete programs within MedAct: weapons and war, economic justice, ecology and climate change, and health and human rights. We're having a broad agenda for strategic reasons. This is a deliberate choice being made, and there are many people who've advised us not to try and adopt such a broad agenda, because you lose focus. It's much more difficult to achieve impact across such a broad agenda than it might be with a more focused, narrow, and selective agenda. But I think, as Andy has said, there are important interconnections between these different issues. And part of what MedAct is set up to do is to draw attention to these interconnections and the synergies, both negative and positive, that exist across them. What are our hopes for the future? MedAct is small now, but we're hoping over the next 2 to 3 years to grow the organization, to reach a point where we've got enough income to hire 5, possibly 10 staff, if we're really ambitious and successful, to grow our membership from its current base of about 850 to 3,000, but at the same time to be able to harness the support of tens of thousands of health workers in the UK around campaigning work and advocacy campaigns. There are over 1 million health professionals, health workers in the UK. So it seems not too ambitious to talk about harnessing tens of thousands of those health workers to address some of these social and political pathologies. We want to target and advocate and change and shift the behaviors and policies of politicians. But in addition to that, we see MedAct as being an engine for progressive change within the wider health community. So part of our key advocacy targets will include politicians, but they'll also include the other professional organizations of our community, such as the BMA and the Royal Colleges, WHO at the global level. We're intending to increase project-based funding, and importantly, what we want to also do is to provide a platform for the many other existing health campaigns and initiatives that already exist, but which currently exist in an atomized and fragmented and uncoordinated manner. There's a lot of progressive health activity happening out there, but not all of it is organized as well as it can and should be. Part of the revitalization of MedAct and the relaunch of MedAct will include a new website, an improvement in its ability to communicate, And we're paying lots of attention to thinking about the organizational structure of MEDACT. How do we organize a membership-based organization to be at the same time effective in campaigning and shifting policymakers and being effective political change agents? We're looking at an organizational structure that includes a board, office and staff members, and we're looking to create 4 separate councils for each of the programmatic areas of MEDACT, and looking to invite people to be part of these councils to set the strategic direction of MEDACT over the next 2 or 3 years. Somehow we've got to involve people, members, the wider health community, in taking part in activities that relate to MEDACT. So how do we set up viable project activity and local area groups? That will be one of the challenges of MEDACT over the next 2 or 3 years. And importantly, how do we build alliances with other groups working on similar issues? I think it's amazing that we've managed to get at this conference the input of ecologists, lawyers, and economists who are all keen, in fact quite desperate, to talk to us in the health community. Desperate to be able to harness the social standing, professional mandate of the health professional in support of the work that they do. So establishing these partnerships with progressive lawyers, with progressive economists, is going to be an important part of MEDACT's transition over the next 2 or 3 years. And given the global nature of so many of these problems, an additional challenge will be to establish partnerships with sister organizations in other countries. So this idea of growing MEDACT, revitalizing it, changing it, developing it into a vehicle that can truly harness the voice and the power of the health community is probably going to take 3 or 5 years. And I'm hoping that this conference will be the beginning of a set of activities that will lead up to this. This will include strategic planning around the work of MEDACT in the 4 programmatic areas, conducting more policy and analysis work so that MEDACT can arrive at fairly concrete policy positions and arrive at concrete campaign objectives. There's going to be lots of work required around fundraising, mobilizing the wider health community, establishing partnerships, coalescing with other groups, and ultimately, over the next 2 or 3 years, campaigning for effective change. So, with that, I invite you, those of you who are not members of MEDACT, those of you who are members of MEDACT but who are not perhaps actively involved in MEDACT, those of you who are not yet members of MEDACT, to please join us in revitalizing the organization, growing it, developing it, and helping it to mobilize the wider health community. Much of what's been said today has been of a serious nature, and I hope that over the course of the next few hours today, we will also be able to be both serious but enjoy the company of good people who've turned up today and have some fun as well. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much indeed, David. As I expected and anticipated, that's a really inspirational agenda that I personally feel very energised by, and I hope everyone else does too. We did start a bit late, but we still have some time for some discussion now, and I'm sure there are lots of points and questions and comments that everyone would like to take. We have got the roving microphones, I think, and
would anyone like to contribute? Yes, and could you, as is normal practice, introduce yourself? Sorry, if we could. Here we are.
Press the button at the bottom.
I'm a long-standing member of MedAct and came in because of the nuclear weapons
Sorry,
issue.
could you just introduce yourself,
Yes,
please?
sorry. I'm a retired paediatrician. My name is Sonia Baxi. I've been in MedAct since 1992 and joined because of the nuclear weapon issue. And I want to thank Andy in particular for the linkage of the various topics together. And again, David, for talking campaigning about it. Now, I come from a small town in Sussex, and we have small groups and meetings all the time on all these separate issues. You can have a meeting about the people in Guantanamo Bay. You can have a meeting about war on want. There's a lecture next week from WaterAid. And what I'm seeing is that people do care, but campaign issues are fragmented because people can't comprehend the interlinkage that has been displayed this morning. And the reason we can't comprehend that is because of the power of the economies, which again, Andy, you showed, with all the power being linked in such a small financial vested interest globally. And that's really what we're up against. So the comment I want to make is, I think MedAct needs to look very carefully at the issues David raised about people who do care, do things, but on fragmented agendas, because in this country, we do not have a political party organisation that links all these issues together. And most health workers, and I'm just fresh from a commissioners' meeting, most health workers are fighting like mad to keep the contracts within the NHS and not going out to the private sector. So there are far too many things disturbing our focus of attention, and one needs to be aware of this in launching a new campaign. Thank you.
Sorry,
Good morning. Thank you very much for those two speeches. My name's Peter Hall. I'm Chair of Doctors for Human Rights. I listened to what you said with surprise, in a way. You didn't mention human rights at all, apart from that little small section on the board. The mechanisms, tools and instruments for bringing about what you want are human rights instruments and international human rights law. So the mechanisms are already there. And we have to perceive them as being human rights problems before we can use those instruments, really.
My name is Dr. Bob Johnson. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I attribute entire psychiatric morbidity to past trauma. What I want to add is, in my clinical experience, human rights are therapeutic. This brings the whole thing together. Unfortunately, in psychiatry today, there is something called coercive treatment, which is a contradiction in terms clinically, and has produced, certainly in my practice, a whole range of devastating effects. And I'd like MedAct to move into this area. Thank you.
yeah, and then back.
Sorry, my name's Joe. I'm a junior doctor from Liverpool. Just want to say thanks for two amazing talks. I mean, I think it's interesting that in society at the moment, we have so much advertising pushed at us on this neoliberal agenda of, individualism and everything for oneself. I think it's quite hard as an organisation as this to actually push against that tide when everything's demanding the latest iPhone, iPad, the equivalent. But I don't know if we can sort of work together with organisations like 38 Degrees, which have really done very well to actually mobilise across a whole range of society. And be really interested if MedAct could kind of, that sort of breadth of message that you have, also to work with 38 Degrees, which kind of work very much on individual issues, but have really branched out to attract a wide range of society.
one more contributor at the back. There. There's some very important points being raised, so I think I'd like to ask Andy and David to pick up on these so that they're not lost, and then we'll come back to the audience. Yes.
Hazel Inskip, medical researcher. I think one of the most important comments that Dave made was about having hope and courage, because one of the challenges I think we face is the apathy. And if MEDAC can give a message of why we need to do this because it's actually worth doing, we can all have hope. And garnishing all the organisations that actually can believe that there is hope will make it actually happen. But the media is actually just saying don't bother, and picking up on the previous point, just live our lifestyle just as we are and carry on as normal, expanding our growth because that's what we all want. And so I think the need to bring people together, we could even think about crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, engaging a wider population for MedAct that would really bring a message of hope, would be a really important way in which we might actually get people to take action and to realise that the media message is not just the one that we should all be following.
Any comments on the contributions? Okay.
I've pressed something. Nobody else did. Pam Zinkin, I'm a retired paediatrician. I was in both organisations that formed MedAct, so I've been in it for years. I really wanted to ask how you see MedAct's role in supporting the many organisations that are trying to preserve the NHS, like Keep Our NHS Public, 38 Degrees. As Sonia said, we're spending our time trying to stop CCGs, figuring everything out. And it's such a lot of work underlined by this, but I want to know what you think MedAct's role would be in that.
All right. Maybe just to start with the last question. I'm not sure how MedAct, or what role it will play in terms of campaigning to save the NHS, if it's still savable, I'm not sure. But MedAct has got a global health remit. Some of the issues, the underlying pathologies that I talked about, are clearly relevant to what's happening to the NHS here today. But as I say, this is, I don't want MedAct to be a top-down organisation. MedAct needs to see itself as being a platform to enable the progressive health community to act in a variety of ways on a variety of issues. So quite how MedAct will evolve over the next 2 or 3 years and what issues it will be focusing on over the next 2 or 3 years is to be determined. I just want to pick up on the issue of hope. I think hope is important, but I think it's also important to contrast hope with false optimism. And I think, we've seen tremendous health improvements across the world, and we've seen a 5-fold increase in global health spending, reductions in child mortality, increases in life expectancy. But I think we have to be really wary of this representing a source of false optimism, because the kinds of threats that climate change pose and the kinds of threats that growing militarization and the likely increase in the frequency of war, violence and conflict, I think mean that the gains that we've seen over the last 20 years or so are very fragile and are likely to be reversed. And the final point on human rights, sorry, yes, I didn't mention the word, but as you know, we've got a session this afternoon that does look at human rights medicine, and it is very much and should be part of the vocabulary of MedAct.
I think all the points made were very valid and very important points. I'd just like to really say in response that I think Medact will be what the people in this room or the people in the overflow room want it to be. So I think there's going to be enormous potential for people to get engaged, to undertake activities that they feel are important. But what's crucial, I think, is to maintain a kind of coherent overall analysis so that the whole thing makes sense, so that what we don't do is internally contradictory. And I think that's what people are looking for, and that's why people are lost, because they can't, it's a big picture, they can't quite see the way through. There are many different trends, we're dealing with complex systems. And so what we need to do is to have a very clear analysis which puts health at the heart of policy. And for far too long, the objective of policy in most countries has just been economic growth for its own sake, really, without analysing what the benefits for humanity or disbenefits might be. And we need to replace that paradigm with another paradigm which puts humanity much more at the centre of development, whether it be in the UK or globally. I think we also need to make sure that people believe that they can do something, because they can. And local activity is important too. So, you know, campaigning, whether it be for your local NHS, not to be privatised, but also, you know, getting bicycle lanes, working in your local community can be an important contribution to the bigger debate. It will help to engage a wider public. It will help them to see where their local activity can fit into the bigger picture about promoting health and enhancing sustainability. So I do think if we can engage both locally and nationally and globally, that will be important. We also, as people have pointed out, need to engage, I think, with natural allies. And public health, of course, is by its very nature an interdisciplinary activity. Increasingly, we're looking to political scientists, to economists, to psychologists, as well as the traditional public health disciplines of epidemiology, biostatistics, and so on. And I think it's important to maintain this kind of holistic perspective. So to engage economists, political scientists, human rights lawyers, and so on in the work of Medact is going to be important for getting a multiplier effect, for enhancing our impact. I think it'll also be important to have political engagement, not in a party political way necessarily, but there are people across a range of different political parties, I think, who are disturbed about the way in which things are going, and who likewise are looking for ways of moving forward in a coherent way. So I think if we can provide a powerful analysis with clear policy goals, with clear steps along the way to a much more sustainable and more healthy future, then we can, at least in potentially, we can promote a sort of sea change in the political landscape, which I think is sorely needed, because politics is far too restricted at the moment. Party politics really restricts us to a very limited and partial view of the world and of the future.
Thank you. Are there any other points that anyone wants to raise at this stage? We've got a few more minutes. Yes. 1, 2, 3.
Duncan McIntyre, a long-standing member. One of the strengths, I think, of the medical campaign was its production of authoritative material, which was then used by the rest of the campaigning environment in the 1980s. And I think that is something, I think, to keep hold of. And I remember also the information that was produced in the 1990s on Iraq and health effects in Iraq. And perhaps as a comparison here with CAT, Campaign Against the Arms Trade, again, a small organisation which produces well-researched information which can be used by others. And I think, putting on health service hats, I think we are possibly still able to produce information like that. I think that would be quite an important continuing activity.
Gentleman back.
Thank you. My name is Ron McCoy from Malaysia. I have a very special connection with Medact, because when I read about the Nobel Peace Prize that IPPNW received in the BMJ, I saw it as a method in which we in Malaysia might get involved. So I wrote to McCanWA and became a member of McCanWA. And from there we formed our local organization in Malaysia, and joined IPPNW. So that's the background, and I'm very pleased to be here this weekend and to be able to attend this conference. And looking at the audience this morning, coming from Malaysia, I'd give my eye teeth to have had this kind of attendance at one of our meetings. The problem, of course, is I still don't have my eye teeth anymore. But I think what we really need to do, I think, is to be able to reach out, as it has been suggested this morning, to reach out to not only to the medical profession, but to the other professions and all the other NGOs that are concerned about what's happening in the world today. And in some way, we have to be able to change the disempowerment of the average citizen in the world today. And he can see that a lot of changes in the world that are happening for the worse. And he feels disempowered. No matter what he does and says, nothing seems to change. We now have internet, and I think that's a very powerful method of communicating with people. And I think MedAct, has done that to a certain extent. But I think you need to widen your participation with not only colleagues, but non-medical people outside the profession. I'm not sure how you can do this, but I think you have started very well, and I think you have your basic population, I think, is educated well enough to be able to be informed through the internet. And perhaps one of the great things we have to do is to change the way we think about so many things, not only about the economy and politics, but also the way we resolve conflict. We need to demilitarize diplomacy. We need to change what's happening in the United Nations. But to do this, I think we have to empower the average citizen in your own country, in your own town, in your own village, to feel that he can stand up, speak, and bring about change. So I think that is the most important thing, to be able to change, to eliminate this sense of disempowerment and helplessness. Thank you.
Hello, I am a natural sciences student at UCL. I'm involved in a couple of campaigns similar to MedAct, but for students, so Medicine and Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And I know we've touched on the point of hope and imagination and the importance of that, but I just wanted to add that it's very refreshing from a young person's perspective to hear academics talk in that way. And I think there's a point that needs to be made about not being condescending towards young people that are trying to get involved in these campaigns, and the amount of times that I'm told by people older and more educated than myself that my view is based on youthful idealism is demoralising, and I think it puts a lot of young people off getting involved, and I think that's a key point for future engagement of youth.
Who's got the next?
Is it on? Yes. Thank you. Peter Poor, formerly on the board of MedAct, but currently chair of an organisation called Evidence for Development. David, Andy, thank you so much for that. It occurred to me that one of the things we need to do is to get this discussion out of this room, and it also occurred to me that we should have hired an open lorry and tagged it on the back of the Lord Mayor's show so that a lot of people could have heard this stuff. But I want to particularly refer to the item on knowledge. There's a huge amount of knowledge. There's a welter of knowledge and data and information out there, and we've heard a lot of it. And I'm sure you both agree. Some of it is highly questionable anyway. I'm particularly interested in the health achievements in countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea. We are dependent upon national data, of course, there isn't anything else, but if that is true, I'd really like to know why. And there's little information as to why health statistics have improved in many of these very poor countries where they haven't in other. So I particularly wanted to point you to the organisation I currently chair, which is Evidence for Development, which is based upon the idea that we don't really know or understand what it means to be poor in poor, particularly rural, but also urban households. And our work seeks to provide a new level of information about that fact, what it actually means and what people do about it. And we've currently done a lot of work, mostly in southern Africa. And I think it's of particular relevance in order to understand how people are coping and might cope, particularly with regard to things like climate change, which are bound to make a huge difference in the future. So evidencefordevelopment.com. Please look us up. Thank you.
Just one more now, I think.
Thank you, Son. Yes, my name is Sebastian Lucas. I'm a semi-retired pathologist at St Thomas's. I joined McCann in 1982, having come back from working for many years in Africa, and we had lots of very good meetings among medical students there at St Thomas's. And I have to say, I'm absolutely thrilled to see that the average age is not what I thought it would be today. Old fogies like myself are new down at the front, but actually about 18. Which brings me to the main point, which hasn't really been raised at all, about education. Do you think MEDACT and information from it via it has any role in our current medical curricula in medical schools? Because we have a lot of crap filling up the curriculum. My personal bugbear is, I have to say, too much on ethics, which wasn't invented when I was a student at all. But I think we could taper that somewhat with the more global stuff. I mean, having been in charge in part of curriculum in Guy's and St Thomas's, the issues we're talking about today do not feature. And I really think they should, in some form. Thank you.
Well, I'm terribly sorry. I think we really must draw this to a close. I'll just ask Andy and David to make some final comments. But clearly we're going to have a lot more time during the day for more discussion. And it's wonderful to see everyone so energised. Do you want a final quick word?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, from the colleague who talked from the student perspective, I mean, I suppose my retort to the person who accused you of youthful idealism would be to accuse them of senile defeatism. I mean, I do think it's not idealistic. You know, it's absolutely essential that we do tackle some of these issues. And if anything, it's them who are being unrealistic by refusing to actually look at the data that we have. And this is data-driven. I mean, we're scientists, you know, and we've got to look at the data. And if you look at the data, then the patterns are pretty clear. And I think that's what you need to confront people with and say, okay, here's the data, now what are your comments? And if they can't comment on it, then, you know, clearly they're not competent. So I would, you know, basically respond with data and try to engage them on that basis. I think this whole abuse of evidence is really, really important, and that's one of the things that the health community has, I think, brought to the broader scientific community. It's quite striking when I talk to scientists from other disciplines that the whole idea of, for example, systematic reviewing and trying to get an unbiased view of the evidence is something which has been quite influential. I mean, you can't necessarily apply, say, the randomized trial to everything, of course. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the rigor of looking at evidence, trying to look at all of the evidence and coming to a balanced conclusion is a very important discipline, and it's one which is affecting the broader scientific community. And it is also politically very powerful because it's very difficult to argue against good quality evidence if you confront someone with it. So I'm all in favour of that, and I think we should work with, or MEDAC should work with organisations like Evidence for Development. I would also agree very strongly that there's a very important role for ensuring that some of these issues are dealt with in a very professional way in the curriculum. And we don't have enough people in the UK who are teaching at the undergraduate and postgraduate level who really looked at the data and who can teach on it in a way which is kind of reflective and self-critical and so on. MEDAC does have a history, in fact, of developing curriculum materials in the past. Some of the original global health materials were developed through MEDAC. So I would like to see, I mean, one possibility is you actually get a curriculum working group which actually does develop professional materials for curriculum. And I imagine that a lot of medical educators and health educators from other professions would be delighted to get those teaching materials and would probably use them very widely. So I think it's a real opportunity for MEDAC.
Very quickly, yeah, I mean, it is amazing what is not taught in universities and schools for that matter. So that is an important issue that we do need to tackle. On the issue of senile defeatism, I'd agree with that. But that cynicism, I think, also reflects this lack of imagination, this lack of belief that there is an alternative. So that's why I was wanting to emphasize the need for imagination, the need to be able to unlock the way in which we feel that we're stuck and we're constrained into a single way of living, that there is choice, that there are alternatives. And we as a community, I think, are really well placed to provide that imagination and that thinking. I didn't respond to the issue of 38 degrees. And, 38 degrees has been this, it's been an injection of energy into the political system over the last 2, 3, 4 years. And certainly I have in my head the idea of MedAct acting as a kind of 38 degrees for the health community. If we can crowdsource the 1 million+ health professionals, health workers in this country, and get at least a good proportion of that community to speak with one voice on various issues, I think that would be amazing. And the technology is there. So there's lots that we can learn from 38 degrees, and we intend to do that. But I just want to again reiterate the point that MedAct is at the beginning of a process of change and development, and that you're all invited to shape that change and development over the next 2-3 years. Thanks.
Well, I'm sure you'll all agree that we've got off to a wonderful start. I'm sorry we did start a bit late. So I'd now like to ask everybody to be terribly disciplined. Could you all please leave the coffee area promptly at 11:30 so that we can make a start at 25 to 12. Thank you very much indeed to both of you.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you.
Wet Saturday morning is fantastic. It's really brilliant. It's really brilliant. I know, we're competing with the Lord Mayor's show. Oh, is it? I'll have to, I don't, the whole thing falls apart.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt the buzz of conversation, but I think we really ought to make a start now. Welcome back, all of you. My task now is a very easy one, which is to introduce Richard Horton, who absolutely needs no introduction as the editor of The Lancet. And I would like to take this opportunity not only of thanking him for coming along today to take charge of this panel discussion, but also for the enormous amount of support that he has given, both personally and through The Lancet, to MedAct and the issues which are of such importance to us all. So welcome, and thank you again for coming.
Thanks very much indeed, June, and it's really wonderful to be here. It feels like this is a special moment, doesn't it? It does, it does. I tell you, I have been so looking forward to today for many, many months, and it really does feel like the world has just turned slightly differently today from what it was yesterday. I'm really upset that Dave feels that he's too radical. He is not too radical. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing to be called radical. Somebody rather unkindly circulated something on Twitter about me last week which called me slightly bonkers. So I think radical is pretty good. I'd rather be called radical than slightly bonkers. So Dave, well done. This session is entitled Building on a Fine Tradition. And we really need to remember that we have a fantastically fine tradition to build on. Does anybody recognise this guy?
That one there.
I'll tell you who it is, not me on that side. This guy here, this guy. This guy is somebody called John Ryle. John Ryle was Regius Professor of Medicine in Cambridge back in the 1940s, and Cambridge killed him. It was terrible. They wouldn't let him do anything. The whole thing fell apart, and he was one of the brightest physicians of his generation. He decided, all this academic medicine stuff, forget it. It's a disaster. So he went off, and in 1943 opened the very first department of social medicine at the University of Oxford and created the Institute of Social Medicine, and gave up a lifetime of doing his research in gastroenterology and dedicated himself to an entirely different career. And this is what he said: the physician has a responsibility in the matter of disease prevention and health promotion and in the advocacy of social and other measures to secure them. What I want to do over the next few minutes before we come to our panel discussion is try and answer Dave's question about what can we do. So, first of all, the fine tradition. John Ryle, great man, died in 1950. But we have a fantastically fine tradition today. We have the radical Michael Marmot, who has done, he's become this amazing guy, actually. I mean, he spent a lifetime doing inequalities research, and he's kind of let go of the handlebars of this academic bike that he's been doing, and he's performing the most incredible gymnastic political arts in holding this government accountable. A wonderful man. Also, our wonderful Alison Pollock. You didn't know I was going to show that picture, Alison, did you? Alison really, truly is an exemplar to us all of how you can use knowledge and research in a very clear political trajectory. Anne Johnson as well. Anne Johnson is a professor and director of public health in University College London, and her work over many decades as well has put public health firmly at the centre of policy. And we've already heard about Martin McKee. Martin has done a brilliant job of holding this particular government accountable for its destruction, not only of the NHS, but also of the public health system that's taken centuries to form. So the fine tradition continues. Now, what is it we can do? I want to look very briefly at 3 areas that we can all take part in. The first is to call urgent attention to neglected issues. Now, Frank, where are you? There you are! Stand up, my friend, stand up. We need to celebrate you. Never, ever, ever underestimate the power of the human voice. When it's wisely used, critical interventions can make a huge difference to the trajectory of politics. And as Andy said earlier, the health community has a privileged position. We are the voices of the voiceless. We are the advocates of our patients, the public, our communities, our societies, our nations, holding governments accountable for what they do to them. And here, Frank, with others, and please notice Ian Chalmers' name up there as well, signing important statements recognising the moral conscience of the health professional community. And you can put these groups together on huge global issues in many ways. Here's another open letter that was regarding the violations of medical neutrality taking place in Syria, led by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was, as you know, a former Director General of WHO. So, don't underestimate the power of your voice. I want to come to a second dimension of what we can do, and that relates again to what was identified in the first session, using science as a tool for activism. Now, you don't have to be a Michael Marmot producing endless papers and reports to justify your activism using science. You can use the tools of science on the evidence that others have generated. Because science at the moment is treated in a rather impartial, non-political way, in a way that's actually very damaging. We now talk about the wonder of science. Well, here's what Mark Walpert, who is a very fine chief scientist in many ways, said when he went to dinner with Michael Portillo a couple of years ago, and it was on television. And he said, I go to work recognizing that ultimately the more we understand about health, it will be good for the health of the population. But do I think about the patient as the first thing? I am a doctor, but no, I don't, which is an extraordinary statement. Extraordinary. I think about the wonder of science and about finding things out. Now, frankly, that statement seems to me that should disqualify him from being the chief scientist of this government, and certainly should have disqualified him from being director of the Wellcome Trust, if he doesn't think about putting the patient at the centre of his thinking about the role of science in society. Because that isn't what science was meant to do. Go back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, and in the introduction to Diderot's encyclopedia, this is what this guy said about what science was for. It will contribute to the certitude and progress of human knowledge and new advantages to society as a whole. In other words, science and knowledge was about changing society. That's why we do it. We don't do it for ref points. We don't do it to get papers in journals. We don't do it for its sheer wonder. We do it for something very real and very material. And if I look at some of the global health work that we've been privileged to do, it comes down to individuals like you. The whole movement on child survival of the past 10 years comes down to this one person, Jennifer Bryce, who had this vision about how you can use science to change the politics and the trajectory of that politics in global health. And we've been very fortunate over the years to work with networks of people like you to create the knowledge base that gave politicians and policymakers the confidence to change the way we think about the role of the child, the mother, the woman in global health. Not only is it about building that knowledge base over years, it is also about thinking about how we use tools of epidemiology in very dangerous settings, but to, again, hold governments accountable. Now, we got heavily criticised by Tony Blair, and God forgive me, I voted for him in 1997, but we all make youthful mistakes, I'm afraid. I confess that was a youthful mistake. We voted for him, but we went to war, and with these two papers, though they were heavily criticised, the epidemiologists within the Blair administration at the time all defended this work and said that it was the best available evidence to show that the type of military interventions that were taking place in Iraq were unnecessarily targeting and killing civilians in their hundreds of thousands. Science, again, being used in this particular case to fuel a very successful, although it didn't stop the war campaign, which many of us found ourselves going on marches, speaking on platforms around the country. Again, triggered by what? Great science, not simply the wonder of the natural world. And we've tried over the past decade to think about how we can provide, in a sense, a menu of knowledge that different groups can use for their activism. I just pull out 4 of these here, although Patty will disagree with me violently for saying this, and I'm sorry, Patty, but the nutrition series we published earlier this year was used, I think, very effectively to advocate for greater attention to undernutrition at the G8 meeting this summer. The series that we did on South Africa, again, a bunch of scientists, health researchers coming together to provide the knowledge base for the post-Mbeki era under Jacob Zuma, which can then build universal health coverage. Aaron Motsoaledi used that evidence and is still using that evidence. Universal health coverage, the big idea in public health at the moment, again, putting the evidence together for that. And then on December the 3rd this year, we're launching a commission on investing in health, which tries to restate the case for why investing in health post-2015 is so important. So I hope that we can work much more closely with MedAct in this vision about using knowledge as a political instrument. The third dimension is not only using health and science for activism, it is using it for activism and accountability. Accountability is a really important thing, and I think a very special role that MedAct can play a part in. What is accountability, though? Let's just get that straight. Accountability is about monitoring. It is about gathering together the best data according to a set of simple indicators building that information base and tracking it over time. But it's not only that. It's also about then creating transparent, participatory, democratic forums where people from across society can come together to discuss what those data mean, and the third part, what action we need to take based upon those data and those discussions, what remedies we have, and how we progressively realise the right to health in our communities. This is an aspect of something that is very much neglected in global health. We talk rightly about distributional issues in justice, but there are procedural issues in justice as well. How we come to make the decisions in our societies and our institutions. And again, this is where MedAct has a particular comparative advantage. I've been lucky in being part of a group that's been involved in tracking women's and children's health, and we go to 2015, the end of the MDGs. And we've been trying to make recommendations, again, doing exactly this, monitoring, reviewing, and then proposing actions. This is called the Independent Expert Review Group for Women's and Children's Health. Can we do the same? Well, let's come back. I hope MedAct doesn't not follow these changes taking place in the NHS, because I think MedAct can be an extremely powerful voice holding government accountable. Let me take one example, the global burden of disease. In this work that was published earlier this year, what Chris Murray and his colleagues did with a team based in UK Public Health, they concluded that the performance of the UK in terms of premature mortality is persistently and significantly below the mean of the EU15 and requires additional concerted action. And next May, we're publishing a further tracking report on the progress of the NHS in terms of premature mortality endpoints and others in a much more detailed analysis. We need to use the power of science to track the impacts of the atomization, fragmentation, destruction of the cohesiveness of the NHS and see the effects that that's having on patients. Science can be your weapon to do that, and MedAct can be your platform to hold those governments accountable. In addition, if you think about this globally, again, you can use networks of universities, networks of scientists to hold people accountable. Again, this particular woman, Rita Giacomin, and Ian knows her well and might say a few words about her a little later, again, put together this incredible international network with the help of others to focus our attention on the occupied Palestinian territory. And with a series that she led and published with the help of Ian and many others in 2009, we've been able to start tracking progress in Palestine with meetings that we have every year where research is presented in 2010, 2011, 2012, and in December we'll be launching the next report on progress in health in Palestine. So annual tracking, using research as your mechanism to do so, MedAct can begin to put those networks together very powerfully. I also want to pay tribute to Andy here, because his work on thinking about energy and health and climate change has definitely changed the way we think about the whole issue of climate. Before Andy's work, we thought about climate change as an issue of the environment only. And then when Stern 1 came along, we thought about it as an issue of economics. And Andy and his team at the London School made us think about it as an issue of health and well-being. And then with others at University College London, they came up with this commission, which then made the conclusion that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. The problem for us in the academic community is that we don't have a mechanism to continue the advocacy based upon the science. And that's what MedAct can do. You can take this, work with us, and take this and then build the continuous advocacy in programs and campaigns into the future. We're now working on Climate 2. We met this week to think about where Climate 2 will go. This is Anthony Costello, who's leading that project. How could we work together so that when we deliver this report in 2014 or maybe early 2015, we've got a really well worked out campaign on climate change. We also want to try and get young people involved in this, because too often we have very, very senior people in academia leading some of these efforts, but how do we get this new generation really, really plugged into this use of science for political campaigning and advocacy? And we were sitting, a few of us were sitting in a pub a couple of years ago, Rob Aldridge, Louise Hurst, and others, and thinking about what can we do differently. And so we said, well, let's create our own mechanism. Let's have an annual one-day meeting where we bring public health scientists together, very much focused on what can public health science do for society. We held the first meeting last year, and this is some of the issues that were picked up. How do we hold public health responsibility deals accountable? What are we doing about tobacco control? What about minimum unit pricing for alcohol, and how do we think about refugee health in our country? These are all very, very hot political questions that the public health community can have a voice on. And by using a journal like The Lancet and then hopefully MEDAC 2, we can create this opportunity for stronger activism, because we need to go beyond simply thinking about what's at the centre there, ordinary clinical care, and even the health system, and even the social determinants of health. We've stripped politics out of the way we think of health and medicine, and we need to repoliticise our thinking about health and medicine. That seems to me one of the critical objectives that we have. Andy was talking earlier this morning about a big picture. What big picture could we have? This is my big picture. My big picture puts people right at the centre. But what we have on our world, on our planet, is we have a set of physical systems and a set of human systems. The physical systems are the ones that Andy identified, Johan Rockstrom's work, the idea that we live within a safe space. There are boundaries to our living, and we have to address these issues, because as we damage the environment, living in this Anthropocene era, we will see the extension of extreme events, failures to address water and sanitation, threats to food security, epidemics of disease, and huge impacts of population and migration. And those physical system changes which will lead to these other events, we have to think about very, very carefully what our approaches to those. But in addition to the physical systems, there are also the human systems, the social, political, economic organisation of our society, and how we build sustainability and resilience in those systems. If you look at the history of civilizations, it's when those social, political, and economic institutions fail that societies collapse. So those issues have to concern us. Again, it comes back to notions of procedural justice, not just distributional justice. In the world today, you're not allowed to criticize. If you go to meetings like the UN General Assembly, this is the slide I took sitting at a desk in the UNGA in September. MDG success. It was on everybody's desk. And the only thing you were allowed to talk about was success. Anybody who raised any criticism at all was pilloried as not being on side with MDG success. We have to be able to hold the system accountable. As much as we love the MDGs, as much as we love sustainable development goals, as much as we want to advocate on behalf of global health, sometimes we have to criticize and we have to hold these systems accountable. And I think one of the most powerful things that Dave and others have led is this idea of a global health watch. The idea that an independent community, a group of constituencies, can hold the global systems accountable. And I hope that MEDAC continues with Global Health Watch. Let me end with John Ryle. John Ryle's book, in which he set out his philosophy about how he saw the world and how he saw medicine and public health informing political decision-making, was called Changing Disciplines, and it came out in the 1940s. And what he said in that book is, human justice is still a shoddy affair. But accepting this, what can we as a profession do about it? And that was Dave's question. And what he said, and I think is absolutely right and relevant today, science and conscience cannot in future be permitted to develop in detachment. And if a former Regius Professor of Medicine at Cambridge, a former professor at the University of Oxford can say that in his 60s, then I'm damn sure that we can all say that in 2013. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we have a fantastic panel who are going to address this issue of social medicine and health activism, building on a fine tradition. They all have 6 minutes, and then if they stick to their time, we'll have a good opportunity for audience participation. So, John Hillary from War on Want and the Progressive Development Forum, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm really thrilled to be here. have been associated with MedAct for a long, long while, but I'm absolutely thrilled to see so many people here for the relaunch of MedAct, for this conference. And it's a real tribute, I think, to the energy, the inspiration, and the leadership being shown by Dave and the others who've really taken this forward. So thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for being such inspirational leaders in this whole field. MedAct, for me, looking from the outside as a non-health professional, has such an important role to play, not just in terms of bringing together great constituents of powerful people to act in the cause of social justice, but also in the way in which it's absolutely prepared to link up all the key themes: poverty, injustice, ecology, war, the things which many other groups shy away from because it's too political, it's too radical. But embracing that politics and embracing that radicalism is absolutely where MedAct should be, and I'm really thrilled that it is. But we have one thing which we can probably say in the 5 minutes which is allotted to us here, and I want to concentrate on power. Because I think that that is, again, where MedAct has done so well, to be focusing on power. And this session is about confronting, challenging power. Not just the abuse of power, not just the fact that we want to hold power accountable, but challenging the accumulation of power, challenging the concentration of power. And the fact that we've seen over the past 30 years this massive concentration of power, of wealth, of influence in the hands of a small elite. At the transnational level, you've got the transnational elite, often called the transnational capitalist class, which meets in all of the secret forums, whether it be the World Economic Forum or Bilderberg or the Trilateral Commission. At the national levels, this massive polarization of wealth, influence and power in country after country across the world, north and south, where you see that the share of national income rising which goes to profits, and the labour share of national income falling everywhere. Ordinary working people being excluded, being pushed to the margins, and finding that their democracy is actually a hollow term. And I think what's so important for us at War on Want, that MedAct stands with us in challenging power, is precisely because you've got two options. If you notice that power has grown so immeasurably in the global economy and in our own national space, you've got two options. On the one hand, you can stand up to power, which is where we are. But on the other hand, you can cozy up to power. And cozying up to power has become the smart alternative which so many other NGOs and civil society actors have taken. And that is a profound threat. If those of us who work in the non-governmental sector, in the civil society sector, are not prepared to stand up to power, then we are surely failing in our primary mission. And if you see some of the things that have been happening, we're talking about power relationships, power collaborations across all fields with the corporate sector. You may have heard earlier this year we were debating with Save the Children about their new partnership with GlaxoSmithKline. And it was funny because the chief executive of Save the Children, Justin Forsyth, was joking. He was joking about the fact 10 years ago he said, I was campaigning against GSK, and here I am working with them, with the chief operating officer of Save the Children having been brought in from Glaxo. So GSK is now linked in at that level. Links with philanthrocapitalism, the Gates Foundation. If you have a television, you might be interested in a Panorama program coming up sometime this year later, which is looking at exactly the power of philanthrocapitalism and the Gates Foundation's rolling out of its own agenda across the world. Not just a benign agenda, an agenda promoting genetically modified organisms, genetically modified crops, and the greater concentration of power in agribusiness across Africa. And then you think of government power. How should we respond to the state? What about the Department for International Development, which is now piling so many hundreds of millions of pounds of our money into aid budgets and aid programs, which we would consider to be completely and utterly regressive? Again, not ending up with any positive outcomes in the rest of the world at all, but seeing more concentration of power and more concentration of wealth to the big corporates which operate around the world. And I think we won't even wait for Patty to disagree with you about the Nutrition Summit. I'm going to get in there first, I'm afraid. The Nutrition Summit, which was held before the G8 this year, was billed by the government as a golden moment, quote unquote, a golden moment for David Cameron to be able to promote himself as some form of leader in the fight for social justice, while he's putting the boot into people here at home and around the world, sending more people to food banks than there's ever been, starting up a Red Cross program in this country for the first time since the Second World War. The NGOs and the big charities were queuing up to say that David Cameron is on our side because he is contributing a little bit more money to the fight for nutrition around the world. And if you looked at DFID's website, it's absolutely extraordinary on this. Look at DFID's website about what the importance is of fortified foods, nutritional programs around the world. The case studies that they chose, and I kid you not, the case studies were Afghanistan and Gaza. That the girls of Afghanistan need fortified rusks rather than an end to 30 years of war and occupation. That the people of Gaza, the children of Gaza, need fortified foods while they're getting white phosphorus showered down upon them and burning to death under the latest Israeli assault. It beggars belief that this can be the type of political program that the NGOs are buying into. My background is not as a health professional, as I say. It's to come from a health systems perspective, and particularly looking at the threat to health systems posed by the commodification of health in the global economy. And this is going to be, I don't know if we're allowed to do our own little plug for parallel sessions this afternoon, but this is what we're going to be talking about in the parallel session on the political economy. I know from my own perspective the importance of medical professionals joining in these struggles, because we can all talk from the abstract political theory end of things about how important it is to hold systems together and to resist the commodification of health. But you, medical professionals, speak with an incredibly powerful voice, probably a better microphone. You speak with an incredibly powerful voice, because you can tell it from the grassroots. You can actually say what the impact is on real people of real health systems when they are turned into systems for profit rather than
don't give me another
for social use.
John.
It's obviously I've come at the end of my time.
Other people speak.
Thank you so much. We did say to Richard he had to tell us when we had 1 minute to go. Yeah. I'm now at my end. Thank you so much.
Okay. Our next panelist is Tamazin Cave. She's a researcher and campaigner and director of public interest investigations. Tamazin.
Hello, I'm going to sit and then I'll just throw something at me when it's a minute to go. I'm going to go over, I think. Very briefly, I work for an organisation called Public Interest Investigations, but we run a project called Spinwatch, which basically does what it says on the tin, in that we look at networks of power and those influencing public debates. And since 2007, I've looked specifically at the commercial lobbying industry in this country. And what I want to talk today is I want to recruit as many people to the cause, in that this is not something that specialists can look at. We can all look at the lobbying industry. It is a very large industry in this country. It's estimated to be worth about £2 billion. It's the third largest in the world after Washington and Brussels. And it's incredibly organised. It's not some nebulous, mysterious thing. You construct influence, and it's using a set of tools, the media being a key one. But there are lots of ways that it's done, and the key thing to remember is that when you can see it, you can see lobbyists at work, they become less effective. I mean, it's a known thing amongst the lobbying industry that their effectiveness decreases the more noise there is around their activities. So it's important that we know about what they're up to. In the context of health, in 2011, we had a small amount of money to look at what was happening with the private healthcare industry, lobbying for the reforms. It was a little bit late in the day. We should have done it in about 2005 or decades earlier, but that was where we started. So what I want to do is talk through quickly how we looked at three different sets of players involved in the lobby. The first is the most easy to spot because they are media players, and they are focused on getting their message out through the media, and they are what we call third-party advocacy groups. They are, or you can call them front groups. They are groups set up who typically don't declare their funders, and they are there to promote, champion the reformers' messages in the media. So, for example, we looked at, there are two groups, you probably would have heard of them. One of them is called Nurses for Reform, the other one's called Doctors for Reform. And they rely on the fact that your profession is very credible and very well respected. Now, these two groups, I first came across them listening to the Jeremy Vine show on BBC Radio 2, which has about 5 million listeners, the second most listened to current affairs programme on the BBC, and they were there championing the reforms, telling the government to go further. You have to just then, they were presented as, the head of Nurses of Reform was presented as a nurse, she is. Doctors of Reform, it is led by a GP, he specialises in Botox and things like that, but that wasn't mentioned. Anyway, but it's who's behind these groups. Now, with Nurses of Reform, you can't actually see. They don't declare their funders, but when you start looking at their advisory group, you see that there are enormous links to free market, right-wing think tanks, the Adam Smith Institute, which has an agenda for privatisation. Doctors of Reform was slightly easier to look at their funding source. They are connected to another free market think tank called Reform, and it is supported, this is a very brief kind of way of looking at it, but it's supported by, among others, private health insurers. And it was back in 2005, there was a group of private health insurers saying, look, we need to get this country getting more private health insurance, but it can't be us saying it, we need to get others to say it, like the think tanks. Fast forward 6 years, and you find that Prove Health is the largest donor sponsor of the Reform think tank that then supports Doctors of Reform. That ends up on the second most popular current affairs programme on the BBC. So this is how it works. It's the construction of influence. So they're the third-party lobby groups. Then we looked at the advisors. There's so much I could say about people like McKinsey, but we started by using freedom of information. The Freedom of Information Act, and I littered the Department of Health and all through the kind of health bodies with FOI requests to try and find out the level of access and influence this one particular organisation was having. I was absolutely astonished. I mean, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. From the top of the Department of Health right down to the new commissioning groups, and at every level in between, the old PCTs, strategic health authorities, and Monitor and the regulators, obviously run by ex-McKinsey people. It was astonishing the level of reach that this one management consultancy had within the health system. And you then see that they're advising on strategy, implementation, they're doing the research, they're helping construct the new architecture, they're mentoring senior staff. It was incredible. But at the same time, they're also working for private sector clients. And there was one time where there was an email exchange between Monitor, the regulator, and McKinsey, and they were talking about how, we've started to share our thinking on the health and social care bill with our private sector clients. Would you like to meet to discuss it? And these clients, they're notoriously secretive about who they represent, but they work for private health insurers, pharmaceutical companies, private hospital groups. There were other emails we found where they were talking about they were brokering a relationship between NHS London and a private hospital group, a German private hospital group, about taking over the management of London hospitals. They advised the government on doing it one at a time because of the political sensitivities of that. So you can get this kind of information out through FOI. The third group is looking at the kind of day-to-day lobbying for reforms. So looking at firms like Capita, Bupa, Virgin Healthcare, KUK, people like that, they have a lobby group called NHS Partners that's been very active in countering. Somebody mentioned it earlier. They called it maverick behaviours on the behalf of commissioners to try and keep the service public. They lobbied the minister, they lobbied the regulator, they, in a sense, colluded with the regulator to get an inquiry into these maverick behaviours. They got the inquiry that then said, people are dying because we're not outsourcing to the private sector. This was all done, obviously, secretly, and they got what they want. So just in the last couple of seconds, this is I've tried to give you the kind of practical ways that we look at it. There's a lot of information actually already out there, and if you know some internet search tools, for example, you can find some great stuff. We found the quote that Mark Bripnell famously said, the NHS will be shown no mercy, and that was using a very, very straightforward Google internet search tool. I didn't go to I wasn't one of the private health executives that he said it to, but we found it. So using freedom of information, although there are now abuses of FOI, this government's doing, I'm coming. Anyway, knowledge is an incredibly powerful thing when it comes to lobbying. The more you know, the less effective they become, so get stuck in.
Thanks, Tamsin. Our next speaker is Ian Chalmers. Ian is editor, director, leader of the James Lind Library, co-founded the UK Cochrane Collaboration, World Cochrane Collaboration, and is an all-round great advocate and great guy. And it's great to have Ian here with us today.
How can I get back to the screen and get my slides up?
I don't know how I got onto it. Is there a...
I put the slides on earlier, I just can't see them.
No. Is there a technical... because we did just have the...
it's on desktop, but I just can't get the desktop.
So maybe...
I feel apologetic for using the slides.
Okay, we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you, Ian. So you saw him. So and he'll be back with us. So let's go next to Patty Rundell, who leads Baby Milk Action and is a vociferous voice for justice.
That sounds awful, doesn't it? So I do this one. Hello, it's really lovely to be here, and I'm so glad that MEDAC is starting again because they've been a great ally of ours through this struggle. Baby Milk Action's been around as part of the International Baby Food Action Network since the late 70s, and we've been trying to protect mothers and babies from the corporate strategies to undermine breastfeeding particularly, but more recently it's more also family foods for babies. So the whole first 3 years of life is our particular remit. Now, the whole thing about breastfeeding and mothers and how they interact with their babies is absolutely locked into this issue of trust and dependency. And so that's why Baby Milk Action and IBFAN have been absolutely always there on the issue of conflicts of interest and doctors. We know it's so crucial to it, so I can't stress enough how important it is that we've had doctors that have literally been able to stand up and not take the lunches that all of you seem to think you can't do without. I've never met any other profession that thinks that it has to have its lunch paid or its trip paid. So for us, this has been absolutely obvious. But once the companies have got you, beware. They do all sorts of things, like actually even in the 80s, Abbott Ross funded architectural services for hospitals. Great, isn't it? What a wonderful thing. Separating mothers and babies for generations. And I just went to Mexico exactly the same thing happening. All the babies separated in the hospitals I visited. Couldn't believe it. So this is where they get in, and they build the trust, and they have a fantastic, wonderful way of being able to tell you that they are now responsible. And if I was showing slides, I'd show you the Peter Brabeck slides where he says, it's absolutely not necessary to regulate us when those of us have got the sort of principles and values at our heart. So you don't need to do it because they're absolutely wonderful already. Now, at the begin, so we have concentrated on getting laws in place, and even though we have this radical sort of crazy Nestle boycott going and street demos and all the rest that we do all the time, what we're doing, it suddenly occurred to me that what we're doing is really, really boringly straightforward. We're just saying, have some laws, stop these companies doing harm to children. The companies that are fighting us and all the people who are asking for deregulation are the wild ones that do everything that they want to. We're the ones that are actually really within government things, and it's perfectly straightforward. And it just occurred to me, why haven't I ever thought of myself? I've always felt like a naughty girl. I'm over 60 now, and I feel still, and I've never grown up. And I'm told off by Richard for even mentioning that somebody might have a conflict of interest on one of his papers that he's published. And I'm not allowed to tell you the name, even though he's the lead author, I'm not allowed to tell you these things, because he will tell me off and shut me up. And that's true, isn't it, Richard? No, you said I could say it. Okay, but it comes back. You come back to all the time that these other two have mentioned, the science gets squiffed. You get a huge volume of research that makes everyone doubt. You get, that wonderful Lancet thing that Richard's talking about. Okay, there's some wonderful things in it, but 8 out of 10 of the interventions on nutrition are nutrient, product-based interventions. And the breastfeeding section, which was always topped the list for interventions, gets this pathetic mention in one of the papers. I'm not saying all of them. And it's promotion of breastfeeding, which is the last thing we want. No woman on the planet wants to be promoted at. You have really bad experiences when you don't have the right advice. And this is at the core of it. There are personal traumas going on with women who have had lousy advice because the doctors are all in league with the companies. They haven't been trained. Some countries, it's all the infant feeding materials are provided by the companies. So of course they're going to get it wrong. And a good third of the British population think formula is just as good, if not better, than breastfeeding. Now, that's a good third of our politicians think that. And so I've seen so many politicians and things who don't want to even mention it. They'll talk about, we'll do a breastfeeding promotion. Sorry, we need to get in there, get legislation that does away with all the bad corporate influence there and make sure that every single mother, as a right, has good, sound information that's commercially free and is not going to mislead her into thinking some product is going to make her baby's eyes better, or all these things that are actually legal now, to be able to tell a mother that the product will make her baby's eyes better. It's unbelievable. My last thing is to come to, so IBFAN, monitors companies. We keep track of them. We brought in over 60 laws. So now in India, if you go there, you cannot market formulas or any product up till 2, Bangladesh up till 5. There's just countries all over the place, thank heavens, doing things that will actually stop these companies doing harm. But counter to that, we have things like the Scaling Up Nutrition and the whole partnership approach. And IBFAN is right in the middle of this. I can't tell you how uncomfortable it is that all our partners, that's in the UN and elsewhere, are now so involved with industry, as my colleagues here have said, that they see that as the only solution, is to actually work with industry instead of control them and instead of working with the governments to get them in line. So you've got the industry on the lead body of SUN, the Scaling Up Nutrition. You've got Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition advising WHO, sitting on all these different bodies, influencing policies at a very core level. It's a very dangerous time for those of us who are what you call whistleblowers, or we produced a paper called Shooting the Messenger, because we're saying this isn't right. You shouldn't be doing this. You should not be having businesses on your core lead body. Please don't do this. And please don't blame us, because we're the only ones who don't say we don't want the Gates money. We actually want to be independent. But we do need some money. But we want clean money. But we don't ever going to go there, because we know it will compromise it. We know it will take us down a product baseline that will betray all the people who care and really want to make sure that all mothers everywhere have the best start in their life, which has been shown to be the best solution. Okay?
And we're going to have time for lots of discussion, I hope, at the end. And have we got the technician here who can help with... I did see somebody... Oh, we've got it up. Fantastic. We've got it up on here anyway. Great, Ian. Come on. Well done.
Can I have the lights down a little bit, please? It's quite important that you see this picture. So could we have the lights dim? Right. Now, the first thing I want to do is to thank Dave and his colleagues for doing what they've done, which led to today. I don't want to thank them at all for forcing me to be on this panel, because I'm really not clear that I've got anything to offer, but I've put something together which I hope may be of interest. This fresh-faced young man was me. I was paid 20 quid by the advertiser to sit for this picture. They put the legend on it, and it implies that if you've got a stethoscope and a white coat, you're a do-gooder. That was just before I went to Palestine. Why did I go to Palestine? Because I had read this appalling document which we, in our imperial power, in which we promised the same bit of territory, didn't belong to us, to two different national movements, making promises to both of them, and we are still seeing the consequences of that. And one of those national movements has been repeatedly betrayed since then. So I went to work for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, in Gaza. My wife did too. I worked in Khan Yunis, which is a camp that had about 45,000 people in those days. My wife worked in Jabalia, which is in the north. When we were there were less than 500,000 people in this strip of land. Now there are more than 1.5. It was that experience, basically, which helped to reduce some of the naivety that I had as a doctor. So what I've tried to do is to address the question, what are the responsibilities of health professionals in influencing important social determinants of health? And I've chosen 4. Unfettered pursuit of profit. Patty will like this. Inappropriate promotion of breast milk substitutes. This young Palestinian shopkeeper is promoting something which is inappropriately called safety milk. In those days, this is the sort of consequence. This child has marasmus. It's being fed out of a heavy-duty hydraulic brake fluid bottle, far too narrow a neck to be able to clean properly, and almost certainly diluted milk because the parents couldn't afford to buy adequate milk. What about economic injustices? Well, Israel itself is an apartheid state. People don't like it to be said, but there are rules which actually discriminate against non-Jews. Those discriminations happen within this state to people who are citizens of that state. But it happens even more in the occupied territories where the lives of many Palestinians, many more than are in Israel, are also subject to discrimination. Abuse of human and civil rights. Well, one of the things in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 28, is the right to protection from forced eviction. Ilan Pappé, a wonderful Israeli historian, has documented the extent to which ethnic cleansing happened in Palestine between 47 and 49. But it goes on. Many of you will know this series of 4 maps showing the shrinking area of land available to non-Jews and Palestinians. And yet, in 1917, we said nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Existing non-Jewish communities accounted for about 90% of the population of Palestine. It's very interesting that one uses a description of people that concentrates on what they're not to describe them. It goes on. This is happening in Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem as we speak. Lastly, wars and civil unrest. The most appalling war recently was the attack on Gaza, the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009. I've been to Gaza. I worked in Gaza for 2 years. I've been back there at intervals. I went there in 2010. I was there last year in September, and in June this year we went back too. This densely populated area was subjected to phosphorus bombing. It's completely crazy to suggest that it's possible to distinguish in this densely populated area people who could be seen as armed militants and the population in general. And this is perhaps the saddest slide that I've got. Israeli girls putting messages on rockets which are going to be fired into South Lebanon, and Palestinian girls holding up a rocket which will be fired into Israel. What does that say about the future of the Palestinian and the Israeli peoples? It's a desperately sad situation. In this article in Medicine, Conflict and Survival, Victor Seidel said, "War and terrorism may be best prevented through addressing their causes, which include limited resources, injustice, poverty, and ethnic and religious enmity, and through strengthening the United Nations and the treaties controlling specific weapon systems, particularly weapons of mass destruction." The causes of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians are actually very simple. British imperial duplicity, that's why we have such an enormous responsibility to do something about it. Unceasing Israeli colonization of Palestine, and our acquiescence in repeated breaches of international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. What are the responsibilities? I go back to this question of health professionals in influencing important social determinants of health. Professional action, as Richard has emphasized, is very important. The series of articles to which he already referred on the health and health services in the occupied Palestinian territory that came out in 2009, I think was a very good rallying point for the data that are available. But it's the cover of the Lancet that the need to recognize the structural and political conditions that are key determinants of population health. So it's not just professional action, it's political action as well. And that's where I wish the relaunched MedAct the best of success in dealing with some of these problems and confronting some of the concentration of power that exists in the world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. Our next panellist is John Lister, who's a founder member of Keep Our NHS Public campaign. He's been a board member since 2005. He's an expert on health services and health policy. John, come and either come or stay or wherever you'd like to be, but come and address us.
Moving lively as a panther. Thank you very much for this invitation. Congratulations on assembling such a lively audience. It's actually, this is, I've been campaigning 30 years around the NHS in Britain, and compared to what I've been doing, which has had its hard times and its good times, this is the hardest way to have to mobilise. It's on general topics, it's on global topics, it's on broad issues. because everybody knows the easy way to mobilise is when you've got something local, something specific, something that actually strikes people and actually they can feel it tangibly and they can respond and they can easily understand the issues once they're set out before them. Some of these, as we've been discussing this morning, are much more complex. It's much more challenging. It's much harder to build the kind of coalitions that you need. It's much harder to find the levers of power to actually go out and make a difference. So to assemble this many people wanting to take that forward as a basis to continue the development of MedAct, I think is a great achievement. I personally know I have come late to the issue of global health. I'm a late developer. I did my PhD at 54 on global health policy. And I've now written 2 books on global health policy. I've been to conferences on global health policy. I still want MedAct to tell me things I can do about global health policy. Mainly what I'm doing at the moment is trying as best I can to save what we can out of the NHS before they wipe it out of existence altogether. So, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that task. I don't think we should underestimate the importance of defending what is left of an integrated public service, one that was actually established as a major historic gain, one that completely superseded and outpaced all of the previous models and mixed models of healthcare provision before it. It completely wiped out the market. It decommodified healthcare. It created a new situation where, the very first time, people could access healthcare independent of their means, independent and based purely on the clinical need. This was a huge advantage and a huge step forward, and it's not been exceeded. Nobody's gone further and better by these various so-called reforms and so-called changes that have been brought forward. Modernisation is not modernising, it's taking us back to the old models, the things we had before the NHS, the market, the mixed economy of health that we had before the NHS. All that is being regenerated by this rubbish around the Health and Social Care Act and the terrible mess that is now being quite consciously made of the National Health Service by the Health and Social Care Act. And I think it's important to see this is a 3-way attack that the National Health Service is under, quite deliberate 3-way attack. This is a slash and burn attack by a government that's quite willing, if necessary, to do 1 term in order to do irrevocable damage to the NHS that will not be reparable by a Labour government of the type that we're likely to get the next election. I think they've quite cynically worked that out, and I'm afraid they're right. So, it's a 3-way assault. We've got the Health and Social Care Act that aims to splinter and smash the NHS structures and to open up more and more of the services that the private sector wants to the private sector to pick up. Okay, but leaving many of the other bits the private sector doesn't want, and there's a large section of the NHS the private sector doesn't want, as an underfunded rump, which is constantly under attack in the media. All these sudden findings about poor quality care and so forth, trumpeted in the Daily Mail and by Jeremy Hunt. And so forth. We had the shocking spectacle the other day of the chief executive of the Foundation Trust Network celebrating the fact that the public's allegiance to the NHS has begun to fall, according to an opinion poll. Apparently only 60% now think it's the best achievement. I think it is. I forget what the phrase was. About 60% now think it's absolutely fundamental to British society, and only about 84% apparently now think that they should be defending the basic structures of a public health system. So it's fallen, but they're celebrating the fact it's falling, because they actually want to break that allegiance between the public and the NHS, and this is a softening up process towards a very different type of system. The Health and Social Care Act, together with the cuts, together with 20 billion cuts currently, another 30 billion by 2020, smashing to pieces the public sector provision and actually reducing the public sector hospitals to emergencies only, so that all the elective cases are going to be progressively diverted to private providers where profits can be made from them. And on top of that, you have the Private Finance Initiative milking out money from the capital infrastructure of the NHS in the tens of billions, much of it going to tax havens and to offshore companies. Salami slicing out for the private sector. Now, my job as a campaigner is to try to mobilise not just health professionals in the sense of doctors, although it'd be lovely to have more doctors campaigning on this and actually up and shouting around it, as many started to do around the Health and Social Care Act. That would be great. Health professionals, in my view, include the whole million that Dave referred to in the NHS workforce. They all play a professional role. The nurses, the other health professionals in the hospitals, the medical technicians, and many of the other people who professionally do what they do in order to maintain the balance of their team that delivers healthcare. I want to reach out to them. I want to mobilise them. How can I do it? I need to find ways in which I can translate this very complex, intersecting, fast-moving crisis into terms they can understand. It'd be great to have more doctors help me do it. It'd be great to have more doctors speaking out. And if we campaign to defend the NHS, we can strike a blow for the concept of universal and comprehensive health for the global market as well. We can hope to re-export the commitment to universal and comprehensive health on a global level. So let's not neglect the NHS while we do, of course, take on board these important international questions. I wish you well, and I'm looking forward to guidance on how I can work better to transfer some of the campaigning into the global objectives as well. Thank you very much.
Well done, John. And next we have Professor Alison Pollock, who's a Professor of Public Health Research and Policy here at Queen Mary, or was there at Queen Mary, this institution, and she's the author of one of the books out there, For Sale, The New NHS A Guide. Alison, you're very welcome.
Well, first of all, it's lovely to be here with so many friends and colleagues, past and present. And really, it's I feel that the thing that unites us is our common struggles and battles, both in the past and, for all of you up there, the battles that are yet to come. Richard was quite right when he says data and information are crucial, and that's what gives us power. And that's really been my starting point as a public health physician. The science for me has been very, very important. And that has been my building block. And I suppose increasingly I'm described as an engaged academic, though I am a public health physician. And in order to generate that data and knowledge, it's not just down to doctors, as you all know. It's increasingly policies multidisciplinary. We need the lawyers, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the health scientists, the accountants, the political economists. And in fact, in all of our work, and I say our because it's collective, the work that I do, is really down to the fact that it's got these interdisciplinary strands. And that's really important. But I think the one lesson that I've learned is nothing prepares you for when you're up against the vested interests and power. And the first time that I and our group really experienced it was when we were early on, when we were doing work on long-term care, and then when we suddenly started in the very early 1990s doing work on the Private Finance Initiative, which, as you know, is a completely discredited policy now. But for the first 20 years, it was the only show in town. It was there is no alternative. And I really thought that when we presented all this careful, meticulous work, the politicians would say, well, thank you very much, Dr. Pollock. Really great work. We're going to change our minds. And I was completely naive. And I remain completely naive, because every time I do a new piece of work, whether it be on injury and rugby with Nikesh, or pharmaceuticals and access to medicines like misoprostol, which is being rolled out across the world in maternal health, I keep thinking people are going to say, well, thank you very much, Dr. Pollock, and your team. It's really wonderful. And I'm not prepared for the brickbats. And that is what I think is what unites us in the audience, is that most of us, every one of us here, certainly from the two-thirds down, have been engaged in enormous political battles and struggles. We're only representing all of you here. And all of you up there at the top, just classic medical student style, you're about to be engaged in them, and you've got them all to come. So I think that's the really most important thing, is that you should know and learn, and you need groups like this to give you solidarity. Several times our unit has been on the verge of being closed down, obliterated, all sorts of questions from politicians and lords as to why we're doing what we're doing, and this is why academic freedom is so important, regardless of the ref. We must defend academic freedom. And actually, it's been largely down to the enormous solidarity and support, and above all, making sure your science is good and it's not corrupted. So do internal peer reviews over and over again. And the reason why your science is better than everybody else's is because when you send an article to a journal, inevitably you sometimes have as many as 20 reviews and referees. And one illustration is when we did the response to Kaiser Permanente, which said that the Kaiser was better than the NHS. Our paper wasn't published for 3 years, and it had 24 different referees before it was finally published. So you have to be also better. I'm going to end because I know Richard doesn't want me to go on too long, but to say that data and information in science is important, the solidarity is important, the constant peer review and criticism internally is really, really constructive. But I am going to end because, like Jackie and John, engaged academics and physicians and nurses and everybody, we have to be engaged with our society. And early on, we had some early warning of this, which is why we came to keep our NHS public when I was chair of the NHS Consultants Association. And a group of us, and though it's like all these campaign groups, it's difficult to keep them going. They get captured by all sorts of interests. We just have to try and hold on to what we've got and make it good. And I'm going to end now because the NHS is important, and I believe campaigns have to be local as well as global. It's no good being missionaries out there if you're not engaging. And I think Richard and the Lancet gave us a very good illustration of that when they actually engaged with what was happening in the UK around the NHS, because the UK NHS was the model for the rest of the world to follow for more than 60 years. And if it can be a trophy for the private sector, which it is, then we've lost. And I have to say that in the last year, we've been working very heavily in the Lords with David Owen, who has now put in a new bill a year ago in January to restore the NHS. And it's an emergency bill, a very short bill with 6 clauses, that's all, which will restore the duty on the Secretary of State to secure and provide comprehensive healthcare for all people throughout England. And with it will come all the powers. It's called the Duty and Powers Bill. It's a very, very simple bill. How many of you have heard of it? A handful. How many of you have now heard of it? You need to get behind this bill, because our only hope is in the political parties. And at the moment, Labour, as John has said, are a complete disarray over what they want, because they were responsible for so much of what we've got in education, health, welfare, immigration policy, etc. So if you don't get behind this bill and actually get them to restore that duty, which is very, very moving, nothing more moving than the opening sentences of the 1944 Act. Really, really beautiful. The duty on the Secretary of State for Health shall be to secure and provide for all people throughout England comprehensive health care. And that's a duty that's been abolished. And that's what John's talking about, because when you abolish that duty, the checks and the constraints on the Secretary of State to rush into the market have gone completely. And so I'm coming back to the local as well as the global, because the NHS has been a symbol internationally as well as locally, and I hope that's what I can take you away with, as well as the fact that challenging power and vested interest is very difficult, and we have to organise and be more systematic about what we do, and I know that's very hard.
And definitely not least, but last, Cameron Stocks, who's the National Director of Medicine. And I'm looking at June, hoping that we can steal a little bit of time, because we did start late, of the lunch break, so we can have some discussion. Cameron, over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and keep it brief. Can you hear me? No? No. I'll hold it closer. Not long enough. Could I have the...
There's a microphone as well.
Thank you. You would have thought this one would be shorter than that one. Anyway, never mind. So, first of all, thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name's Cam Stocks, and I'm from Medicine, which is the UK's Global Health Student Network. And I first of all want to thank Dave for inviting me here today, because Medicine has had a really long relationship and a strong relationship with MedAct over the past 20 years of our existence. And it's fallen off over the last couple of years, but I'm really hoping that we can forge that and move ahead together again. And I'm very pleased that on the new rejuvenated board, there are so many alumni from our organisation as well. So when we were asked to talk as a panel, the two questions we were given were, first of all, could you share your own personal experiences of health activism and confronting power and vested interests? And B, second of all, your thoughts on the privileged and potentially powerful role of the health community as an agent for social and political change. So to answer the first question, I thought I'd think back to my extensive, long career in health activism and global health, all the way back to 2009 when I first started. My first experience of global health was in South Africa. I worked in a HIV clinic for 6 months, and the time that I was there was the time when all of the funding from the PEPFAR program was coming through, and the cost of antiretrovirals had decreased drastically. So there was a revolution going on in HIV care in South Africa at the time, which was incredible. We're talking about trebling the number of patients that we had with access to that care over that short time period. But now, 4 years later, we still only have half of the people globally who need antiretrovirals having access to them. And that, for me, the reason why that's the fact is because we haven't addressed the underlying structural issues. And this is something that's come up again and again today. As health activists, we are extraordinarily successful at short-term campaigns, at mobilizing money, at changing small bits of policy, which do have ginormous impacts on a global scale, but drastically fall short of the potential that we could achieve. And the one thing that's missing from our global society at the moment are strong accountability mechanisms. Mechanisms so that we can hold not just governments to account, but the private sector to account. And this is fundamentally broken, not just globally, but in the UK as well. I mean, we've had so much talk about the NHS, and David Cameron, as part of his platform, said he wasn't going to change the NHS or radically reform it, and obviously that's not true. And we have no mechanisms in our political system without a 5-year delay of holding him to account. So for me, the first thing is accountability, and there are some really neat technological solutions which we can bring to bear on this, in the short term at least, which will fall short. But I was grateful of the mention of 38 Degrees, because whilst I think they're an excellent campaign and they've done a lot of work on the NHS, at the same time they don't allow people to share their voice in the right way. They're very top down sometimes, and this can be said of all of our political institutions, the healthcare system, not the least of them. So just a quick mention for one of the things we're launching soon. We're launching a project called the Open Access Button, which is a way of holding people like Richard to account. The website is prelaunched.openaccessbutton.com. It's on Google Chrome just there. And essentially, if you hit a paywall, it's a way of showing the rest of the world that you wanted access to that paper and that you needed it to treat your patients. So that's just a small example of how creative solutions from young people can hold people to account. And we've got other examples as well. So recently we've been monitoring the progress of sustainable healthcare in the UN negotiations over the last few years as well. And there's a recent Lancet paper that came out on that. So that was my first point. My second point was that vested interests can be extraordinarily subtle. So as health activists, we have to be incredibly critical. 38 Degrees is a good example. Another example is the Coney 2012 campaign, which did the rounds a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you have heard of it at all. It was essentially a video about the LRA and trying to catch this international war criminal, but it had no impact at all. And it was essentially exploiting the apathetic society that we live in at the moment, where people use activism in this consumerist way. People want to be able to click a petition and then leave it. And we're not developing those strong, sustainable mechanisms of direct democracy that feed down to the individual. That's what we need to fix. We need to fix the accountability mechanisms. So My final point is on the second question. The question is, what is the privileged role of the health community? And I'd actually quite like to focus on the word privileged, because we've had a lot of positive discussion about the role of the health community, and we do have a strong mandate. We do have a lot of experience, and MedAct in particular has produced a lot of game-changing policy. But at the same time, if medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale, which is what Virchow said, then we have to be very, very wary of slipping into a system whereby health professionals have a greater right or validity to decide the shape of society than the people we're caring for. And I think it's fair to say that with some of the political systems we have in place for health professionals at the moment, that's true. So I think we're at risk of maintaining yet another unrepresentative political system, and we need to really re-enfranchise the people who are unrepresented in our population. And this is globally, but why don't we start at home? There's currently an undercurrent of rage and discontent in people my age, people from the age of 15 to 25. People have had their access to jobs cut, they've had their access to welfare, which could help them to get jobs cut. The education system is broken. And this is not only a public health time bomb, as Michael Marmot identified a couple of weeks ago, saying that in 30 years' time, these people will have terrible health, and not only will their individual lives be worse, but as a society, our health will lapse back into the state it was 50 years ago. But if the explosive force of their dissatisfaction is not harnessed in the right way, if we do not engage them and educate them rather than just trying to change policy from the bottom up, if we don't reach down and talk to them, then it will manifest in the wrong way, and we as a generation will end up doing more harm than good. We'll buy into the neoliberal lie, and this is already happening. You just have to look at the EDL. A few years ago, we had the Occupy movement. And we had all of the campaigns about access to education. But now that's shifted, and all of the focus is against migrants in this country. And that is simply because we have a generation of dissatisfied youth who need to get their anger out. So if you take one message away from my hopefully less than 6 minutes, it's that please talk to youth, and not just medical students, not just privileged middle class young people, but we need to talk to everybody, and we need to bring them in, and we need to educate them and help them learn so that they can help change this country and the world into the future that we deserve.
Thanks, Cameron. So, June, how much time can we have, do you think? Can we have 10 minutes? Oh yes, she's very generous.
Everybody will eat faster.
Yeah. So let's. I think it's time now to throw it back to you, and let's have some comments. So please put your hands up. There's a hand right at the back, and the microphones will find you. And if you could, I've just been asked if you could stand up so that the cameras that are filming can spot you and say who you are. That would be fabulous.
Hello. Sorry. My name's Raya Feldman. I work for an organisation called Maternity Action. And I'm also involved in a tiny local project with migrants called Hackney Migrant Centre. And I've been sitting here this morning all the way thinking, does MedAct know about how, I mean, not critically, but questioning, does MedAct know how to link the global with the local? And I was very glad, that Alison Pollock actually raised that as an explicit question, and B, that the term migrants was used in the last contribution. And I've been struggling to think, how can I formulate some contribution to this discussion about migrants, because it isn't in the rest of the agenda. Although there is the workshop on human rights abuses and detention, as a workshop, as a framework, that doesn't actually address something very sinister and problematic that's happening in our society at the moment, and that is profoundly connected with the restructuring of the NHS, because it's the movement of people through the world is as much part of globalization as the globalization of companies. And I think that when we call when we have a campaign like Keep Our NHS Public, I think it's absolutely essential that we should add the slogan and the demand, keep our NHS comprehensive and universal. At the moment, there is an immigration bill going through Parliament that proposes to charge foreigners. It has enabling powers that we will have no control over through amendments that will be able to make more and more exclusionary changes. And at the moment, there are loads of people in this country who, not only for public health reasons, and public health reasons are not enough listened to, but for actual humanitarian, common human decency reasons, it would be good to treat and to offer preventive health care to, and to recognise the impact of the really difficult situations in which they live as often irregular migrants at the margins of society. And really, my contribution is simply to ask MedAct, which has done fantastic work on refugees, organised a refugee health network, organised an entitlement working group that's been working for years on keeping everybody entitled to NHS care. But I just want this group to take on board the issue of migrants.
Very good, thank you. I do want to try and get, in the short time we have, as many people as possible. Frank, the microphone will come.
I'll speak without a mic, I can bow
Okay.
out. What I'd like to propose is that the linkage that we see as needed between the local and the global, and between the health professionals and the rest of the population we've been discussing, does perhaps come together in the area of the defense of the health service. And as a simple proposition, patient comes into a GP's surgery, GP cannot obtain a particular form of care for them. Red card scheme, by analogy with the yellow card scheme of side effects of drugs. Dear Minister, my patient, Mrs. Bloggs, has instructed me to inform you that she has been denied the following access to care, and she will take this into consideration next time she visits a voting booth. Collate and publish quarterly. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Okay, I'm looking around the audience, please, and looking for comments and contributions. Please, here. If you could.
I will need a mic.
Okay, that's great.
I'm Ishani Carbrookas, I'm Public Health Registrar. I'm just going to sit down, sorry. The comment I have touches on three themes, one of inequality, of neoliberalism, and also on this whole issue and how we mobilise the public to also be engaged with the issues that we hold so important. And I suppose what I wanted to say is to do with this balance between rights and responsibilities, which we haven't really spoken much about. Obviously, I acknowledge that the balance is probably skewed far far against people in terms of their rights. However, I think that going forward, we've seen examples already of this imbalance between rights and responsibilities playing out and resulting in greater inequality, with people's sense of entitlement resulting in, detraction of rights of others. And so I think going forward and developing and taking forward the agenda of rights in new territories, we also need to be mindful of having a sort of sustainable balance between rights and responsibilities, and that's something maybe to bear in mind as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Right on your far left, my far right. Can you just stand up, perhaps, and the microphone will find you easier, and then the camera can also find you. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Sarah Al-Hulail. I'm a junior doctor from Oxford. This is just sort of bouncing off what Cam said. One of my friends, when I told them that I was going to this conference last week, and I'm, ex-medicine, all of that, said, "Oh, you're just going to sit in a room of, full of amazing people, and you're going to talk about great things, and you're going to do nothing." And then, I laughed, but then I actually had been thinking about it all week, because, we've been going to these things a million times, really, and we've talked about these a lot. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe a bit of a plea to MedAct and the new MedAct. We are a generations that has been, our hearts have been broken, really. We've gone through Obama, we've gone through Make Poverty History, all of that, really. And we have so much energy, and we're a bit tired of clicking on links and saying, that will change, or it won't, really. So, so I guess what I'm asking for is, can we please not let this fizzle out after the conference and have really tangible doing action, because we have a lot of energy for doing, and it would be great if you could harness that, really.
Very good. Right at the very top. Oh, yeah. And just
Hello, I'm Chris. I work at MedAct, and we have 50 people upstairs in a live link room. And we took a question on Twitter, so I thought I'd ask it. This is on behalf of Erica Poole, who's in the room upstairs. Hello, Erica, and everyone upstairs. She says, we've heard about the power of science to provide background for our battles, but can the panel comment on the growing misuse of data and evidence by corporate lobbyists, and how do we do that without getting a bit too technical and keeping the public engaged?
That's very good. Yeah. And now right at the very back, please.
I'm Miriam Beeks. I'm a GP in Hackney and also a member of Medical Justice, visiting people in immigration detention. The practice I work at, the health centre I work at, has two people, at least several people here who previously worked there, I'm pleased to say. Now, I would like just to raise an issue again about migrants. London is a world in one city. 40% of Londoners are born abroad. At least 500,000 Londoners have no papers and are cleaning the underground, cleaning the offices, and at danger of destitution, and are at danger of not having basic preventive health care, such as vaccinations and screening. That is the right of every child born in this country. I, together with Nurse Heggie Wyatt at Lower Clapton, have put a proposal to the local CCG on the issue, these very, very basic issues of ending this inequality, so that people who aren't born here have the right to basic vaccinations and screening, including for TB and all the rest, that every woman, every child has, and every woman has in pregnancy for the sake of her own fetus, unborn fetus. Now, I noticed the response to the Syrian polio epidemic was not to say, let's make sure everybody's had catch-up vaccines, but, oh, please look out for polio. Great. Okay, so we have a situation where we know health for one is health for all. We've said this already. But what I would like to know whether public health doctors are interested in the issue, that if you come here after the age of 5, there is no system in this country, the school nurses aren't doing it, to make sure you have basic vaccinations or screening. Not to mention your access to healthcare is going to be made more and more difficult. And I think our proposal to Hackney CCG hasn't been acted on yet. But I think this is a major issue in London, where we know, for example, the maternal death rate is 19 per 100,000. 3 times what it is outside. Maternal, not child, maternal. 19 per 100,000, 3 times what it is outside London. That Britain has the highest death rate among children in Europe, which has already been said. It's got the highest death rate under 75 in the Western world, apart from the US. And now we are lower than the US as percentage gross domestic product public spending. So really, we are sinking into the situation of a country where there is a vast underclass. They've got away with treating migrants as subhuman. Now, as Cameron said, they're getting away with treating benefit recipients as subhuman as well.
Okay.
Again, yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you very much indeed. And a hand here, yes. If you just stand up so the people can see, that's great. Thank you. Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm a junior doctor from Liverpool. I intercalated in global health in London, and I loved being in London for a year. I came to events like this, I saw friends, I saw the familiar faces, and we had fantastic discussions about what to do about global health. And I guess my plea for the rest of this day is, thinking about how to grasp the imagination and the passion about those people who aren't interested in global health, who it never appears on their radar. Because in the end, we all know that we love this topic and we're pushing it forward. What about the 95% of my old medical school who just thought global health was black kids in Africa, and they weren't interested and they didn't want to push it forward and be an visionary? So please just think how to capture the imaginations of those who don't know about these important subjects, and don't just keep it in this room in this small group of people who already have the passion. Thanks.
That's a great question. I've got a feeling we do need to, but is there somebody who's going to feel really upset if they don't have the last word? Is anybody really? Yes, go on, yes, very good, good. You have the last word. Wait for the microphone.
I'll make it really
Just
short.
say who you
I'm
are.
Xanthi Hall, and I work for IPPNW in Berlin. And I just wanted this last word because I want to reach out to all of you, because I've heard a lot of things today that we are echoing in the German affiliate. And you know, you did say stuff about solidarity and talking with and to work with sister organisations. We're doing a lot of work on global health. We have a summer school every year to try and get new medical students involved in it, and this year we had a skills lab where they talked about actually starting campaigns themselves. So we really need to do a lot of work together on these subjects, particularly also on migration, which is a subject very close to our hearts in Germany too.
Thank you very much indeed. I want you to give the panel a big round of applause, please. And actually, it's June who's going to have the very last word.
Sorry about that, but can I endorse a huge thank you to Richard and the panel. I think it's been an exciting session, and to everybody who's participated in the discussion. Just one very small thing. For this afternoon, you don't have to have signed up to any of the groups. Go to whichever one you fancy. There will be people there to tell you and direct you to the correct rooms. And will you please all, particularly the chairman of the groups, make sure everybody gets back here in time for the final plenary session. Thanks a lot, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.
Inside, you don't necessarily feel it. Yeah, exactly. Well done, Alison. That was great. That was really great.
It's a really nice session.
It's a wonderful audience, actually. It's a wonderful audience. I am. I think yeah, okay. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Yes, we can. Now, but I just need to make sure everyone is all got off okay. So you said for that, so I'll come and find you some okay? Guys, so what are you...
From each of the groups to come up to the stage, please. Right. Any more rapporteurs here? Hello, everybody. Once again, I'm sorry to interrupt the discussions that I'm sure are terribly interesting, but we do need to make progress because I'm sure many of you will have trains to catch and that sort of thing, and so we don't want to overrun on this particular session. So I'll start straight away by inviting the rapporteurs, and I'm under instruction that it's no more than 5 minutes and I'm going to be beastly. So can we start, please, with the Torture, Detention and Human Rights group?
Hi. Jim Welsh very kindly chaired the session, but it looks as though I'm supposed to be talking about it. Essentially, we were talking about human rights abuses of various kinds and the ways in which doctors either participate or oppose them. And what we looked at was first a presentation from Cornelius Katona, who is head of the medical services at the Helen Bamber Foundation, who talked to us about complex post-traumatic stress disorder and the particularly appalling consequences of sexual violence and the resulting severe traumatization that results. Arising from that, there were also questions about the traumatizing effects of the ways in which tortured asylum seekers are treated in the UK, and that was discussed mainly by the audience. The way the abuses of human rights, the extreme ones, implicit in the death penalty and the torture of, for example, Britons held in foreign prisons, and finally a discussion about the ways in which doctors can and do both collude in or strongly oppose effectively torturous behavior by detaining authorities. Perhaps one of the most interesting things that emerged was that Alison Pollock noted a considerable similarity between the traumatized reactions that Cornelius was describing and the consequences at a lower level of the bullying which far too many health staff are experiencing. And that is something that we might profitably develop, because one of the things that is very, very clear is that the neoconservative agenda, which we heard quite a bit about this morning, is producing simultaneously harms to all of our patients, but also hazards to ourselves. We need to think as clinicians how we collectively defend ourselves. And if MedAct can play a part in that, I think we can. I think that's probably one of the more important things we can do.
Thank you. You didn't? Right. Does that sound as though it's working? Right. I think you have to hold it like an ice cream. But I think it will all be recorded. I don't think we can have a repeat at the moment. Okay, can we go on then to the enduring threat of nuclear weapons?
Thank you. The enduring threat of nuclear weapons and war, we were a small group, and to a certain extent we were preaching to the converted, but that for me simply serves to reinforce that there's much work to be done in raising awareness of the issue of nuclear weapons as they are today in 2013. Our very erudite speakers gave us a good outline of where we are as regards nuclear weapons and what they do, much of which is you can easily find out this information. The horrific effects of a nuclear explosion were highlighted by describing what would happen if a nuclear bomb were to actually fall here and now on Barts Hospital, and the effects are quite horrifying. And if you want to find that out for yourselves, you can go on to www.nukemap.com, which I wasn't aware of, but if you can transpose the effects of a nuclear bomb on, you can do it anywhere you happen to be, and it's really quite terrifying. Many of us had become engaged in the nuclear weapons issue by hearing survivors of the Hiroshima explosion talking to us, or by visiting Hiroshima, or during the Cold War, of actually being terrified that we were not going to survive. That was a real reality. So we have a huge challenge in getting that urgency out into the community today, because nowadays many people are not even aware of nuclear weapons and not aware that we have Trident up in Scotland on the Gairloch. So we need to raise awareness. The big issue, of course, for us is that we're now going to be replacing Trident after the next election in 2016. Unless we do something now, and I reinforce that this is urgent, we're going to sleepwalk into replacing a whole new weapon, a whole new system of nuclear weapons, which will be with us for goodness knows how many years. One of the major things with Trident, of course, is that it's estimated it's going to cost around £100 billion over the course of its lifetime. Now that is £100 billion that we were reminded would pay for 600 new schools, 350,000 affordable homes, 70 hospitals, 7,500 megawatts of wind power, or topically 1,280 high-speed trains. So that's a lot of money that we're going to be spending on a system of weapons that we're told we're never going to have to use. So this is a really serious consideration for us. So what are we going to do about it? So the actions, as I've said, we have to raise awareness of nuclear weapons, get it back on the agenda, get it back on the political agenda. And some of the suggestions may seem a bit old-fashioned, but they work. Writing letters to the paper, concentrating on local links. If there's something in your area that crops up that you think might link into the nuclear weapons industry or the nuclear renewal of nuclear weapons, write to your paper about it. Writing letters to MPs, visiting MPs, getting engaged in the local political situation in your area. If I could be allowed to give you a couple of personal experiences of contacting MPs, I have on several occasions visited my own local constituency MP, who just happens to be Ming Campbell. So I visited him and I write to him regularly. And recently I went to Hiroshima just over a year ago, and I went to see him again after that, and I said, I've been campaigning about this for 30 years. What more can I do? I mean, I was almost desperate about this. And he said to me, well, just keep doing what you're doing. Keep writing, keep visiting, because that makes me as a politician have to keep it on the political agenda. So I would encourage you to do that, to write to your MP, visit your MP. I also want to tell you about an experience this summer when I was involved in a pilgrimage from Iona to Westminster. And in the Great Hall of Westminster, we were speaking to an MP, and another MP was with a workplace student, explaining to him that what we were doing was lobbying. And I took the opportunity to say to this lady, just out of interest, what political party are you representing? And she said, oh, I'm from the Labour Party. I'm a London Labour MP, and I won't tell you her name. And I said, well, what are you doing about it? And she said, well, nobody comes to see me about nuclear weapons. So until people come to talk to me about it or write to me about it, then really it's not something I'm going to get engaged in. And she emphasised, don't just sign a petition which comes a day before a big debate. Get engaged long before that. And then if you tell me that you want me to take it up, then I have to do that. So this is just a plea. Don't underestimate the political process. Go to your MP, write to your MP, keep going to your MP, and don't let them off the hook. So that's just my little rant about my own personal experience. The other thing we discussed was nuclear exits and how we have to look more at nuclear exits, how countries that don't have nuclear weapons have either renounced them or not taken them on in the first place, such as South Africa, which has got rid of its nuclear weapons. The other thing I want to... one minute. The other thing I want to give a plug to is ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Look up the website. They're a baby of IPPNW. They're doing great stuff. And the other thing, we saw what happened with chemical weapons in Syria. That is nothing compared to what would happen with a nuclear explosion. The UK's nuclear weapons are our weapons of mass destruction. We know what they do, we know where they are, and those of us from Scotland are acutely aware of this because they're on our doorstep. And I can tell you there's nothing more chilling than seeing a submarine sailing up the Gairloch to Faslane. We know more or less what it's going to cost to renew them, so what is stopping us? What is stopping us from getting rid of them? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely. Can we then move on to climate, ecology and health?
Thank you. Okay, so we heard first about, can you hear me? Yeah. Politics and science of climate change from Charlie Cronick of Greenpeace. I think he's had to go. We heard that the presumption that many of us had most recently with the latest IPCC report that the science would provide the basis for political action has proved wrong in practice, and the thing that is really blocking action is not because we don't have alternative technology or we can't be more energy efficient, because of relationships between institutions. For example, the way that oil companies are lodged in the body politic, to give one example, and a critical one, and that we need to look at creative ways to change those relationships. We heard then about reframing climate change as a public health issue that we need, and Andy started this to point this out this morning. This was picked up by Jeremy White from Sheffield, pointing out that we need to focus much more on the co-benefits and outcomes of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, such as increasing physical activity, reducing obesity, reducing mortality from air pollution, as examples. Then we heard from Guppy Bowler, a climate campaigner, on how to organise social movements. She encourages us to think about how we work, so whether we're working as a campaigner, an organiser, a thinker. And she said we should also have fun, and if we're not having fun, we should stop and start again. So we heard about from Izzy Braithwaite, who's a medical student at UCL, about her work with Healthy Planet and the links to the Climate and Health Council and their activities. We had a really wide-ranging discussion. In particularly, the question was asked: where should we focus our energies? Should we focus on speaking truth to power, or should we focus as doctors and public health professionals on the work we do locally with patients and our local advocacy with local populations? I think it was felt that actually we need to do all of those things. So then in terms of practical action, a proposal to work more closely with the Climate and Health Council to develop link campaigns. Very specific to do. There's an open letter to the Chancellor. You can find it if you're interested in signing on at tinyurl.com. /Osborne letter. It's about our energy policy, essentially saying it's bad for health, and sets out the health impacts of current levels of health air pollution, the fact that the poorest people in society are the most impacted, and asks the Chancellor to commit to meaningful reduction of our dependence on fossil fuels to create healthy, sustainable communities. There is also keen interest to continue to focus on communities and hospitals that we work with in terms of promoting the agenda of the Sustainable Development Unit and looking at practically what we can do to increase energy efficiency. And finally, somebody asked or made the point about what doctors should be known for in terms of pensions, and we should be known for something other than concern about our pensions. And the point was made that we should perhaps think about our pensions in a different way, and particularly that we might persuade the BMJ to embark on a campaign to disinvest pension investment that might be linked to fossil fuels. So just a suggestion to float.
Thank you very much. Intriguing idea. Right, corporate capture of health.
Hello. Yep. Okay. Hello. Yes, we had a very interesting, wide-ranging discussion, and since the speakers are still here, I'm not going to try and tell you what they said because they might object. But briefly, Miriam Epstein started us off by talking about medical ethics and really set up the idea quite nicely to continue the discussion. And it really started from the basis that our current system of medical ethics is pro-capital rather than pro-patient. And I would encourage you to look back at the video at some later date if you weren't at our session. The second speaker was David Miller, and I was really struck by something he said, which was that corporations try to dominate policy by dominating the whole of society. And he talked us through how that happens through media, science, civil society, ghostwriting, lobby groups, with lots of examples. And again, I would encourage you to watch back if you weren't at our session. The final speaker was Jeff Rayner, who gave us some fascinating examples of corporate influence on health, including the fact that the Change for Life social marketing campaign was mainly formulated by an advertising agency. He talked about the government's issues with calling public health issues lifestyle issues, and he told us about the chocolate orange test, which, if any of you have been following politics recently, David Cameron is particularly upset about the chocolate oranges at the front of WH Smith. So we had fantastic 3 presentations, and then we went on to discussion, and I think the discussion was really fantastic, and we talked about 2 main parts. One, what should we be looking at? And the second part, how should we be approaching this? So on the what, well, people talked about, is it time to remeasure GDP? Let's think about a healthy measure of GDP, and we know that there are others working on this already. Let's talk about pharma and all the issues that come around that, but one in particular that came up was about licensing of medications, so let's talk about that. Other what's included, the infrastructure and healthcare, in particular, private finance initiative. And we talked a bit about how could we go about this, and there was a lovely quote which was to kind of get rid of corruption or make things better, let in the sunshine. Okay, so I like that. We talked about local MEDAC groups, setting up local MEDAC groups, which already exist. There are local MEDAC groups, and you should all join them. We talked about the difficulties of having structural type campaigns that we discussed this morning, as opposed to single issue campaigns, which are a more normal way of doing things. I think that is going to be a tension for us looking to the future as MEDACT. We discussed teaching. So when teaching global health, are we considering sociology enough? Someone made the point. And someone asked for specific guidance. What can you do as a doctor to avoid corporate influence? Specific guidance on that. And I think the example that person used was about pharmaceutical advertising, but I think it applied more widely than that. So I hope that's given you a kind of a flavour of what we discuss in our session. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, political economy.
Hello. So we started off hearing from John Hillary, and John was talking about trade. So he started off by telling us a bit about the international mechanisms and how they serve trade and the accumulation of capital in the hands, unsurprisingly, of corporations. And how mechanisms that we have for regulating trade, the World Trade Organization, protects this flow of capital, and also bilateral trade agreements compounding the problem by elevating corporations to the status almost of states who can take states to court when those states limit the profit the company can make in the interests of the health of their citizens. For example, in Australia, where they've recently passed plain packaging laws on cigarettes, and an American US tobacco company is taking Australia to court for this. Consequently, in the UK, as you'll all know, our own plain packaging legislation failed recently because the government was too scared of similar legislation. So trade agreements don't just threaten health, but also food, environment, education, and in a way here, maybe therein lies their weakness, because if we can build a movement across all of these different areas which are under threat in the interest of capital, if we can build a movement to resist this, then perhaps we can go some way towards repealing these international mechanisms. We heard from David Woodward. David spoke about the International Monetary Fund as part of the global economic governance of health. So he acknowledged that there are many, many ways to steer the global economy to benefit health. And he focused on the democratization, or maybe lack thereof, of the IMF. So how the voting system that the IMF has concentrates voting rights in the hands of the largest economies rather than the largest people. And as a result, citizens with countries with the most people. And as a result of this, decisions are taken not in the interests of the global majority, but in the interests of global capital. An example, the recent Greek crisis, for example, there was 70 to 75% debt cancellations were available from the IMF for Greece within 2 years. David compared that to sub-Saharan Africa, where it took over 25 years to achieve a 50% cancellation on a similar problem, and the concomitant decline in the social determinants of health which followed this. So therefore we need to democratize the global economic governance. David McCoy spoke about taxation in health, and I found this particularly interesting. It's not something that ever occurred to me. So global health financing, typically thought about as simply charity and aid, and the interest in domestic funding is neglected. But taxation, I'm sure no one is particularly fond of that word, but it can actually have a lot of positive power. It can decrease inequality, it can provide health services, it can shape health behaviours and regulate harmful trade. But less economically developed countries have lower tax capture due to numerous factors, such as larger informal economies, less efficient systems, and the race to the bottom to attract foreign money by decreasing their taxes. And so therefore we need to reconceptualize taxation as a public health issue. In our discussion, we had three sort of themes ran through it. So first of all, this was all new to me, and I think several of other people in the room. So we spent a bit of time finding out just simply more about the mechanisms of trade, which, by their very nature are actually quite inaccessible. Secondly, we discussed the dominance of neoliberal ideology. And thirdly, we wondered what on earth we could do about it. And so we came up with some suggestions. So the first of which was having a clear vision. If MedAct actually is going to achieve anything, it needs to quite clearly have an idea about what that something should be. The second was to define a niche. And an example that was mentioned is austerity as an economic and social issue with local, national, and international health implications. Thirdly, we talked about using legislative tools where possible, as well as political methods. Fourthly, building on a theme of cooperation, we broached the possibility of building international solidarity. And finally, we didn't actually discuss this, but I was holding the pen, so I wrote it down anyway. We desperately need to evangelise this responsibility of healthcare professionals. There's not been one dissenting voice in this room when we've talked about, health professionals have a mandate to do something about this. But I wonder if I went and spoke to an average doctor on a ward, whether they would think of themselves as a global citizen with a special mandate to, use David's phrase, to speak for the voiceless, be the voice for the voiceless. I wonder if they'd say that, or whether they would think of themselves more as a technician for the body. So we actually need to evangelise this mandate, which we're all presuming, but actually may just be something we're constructing in our heads in this room. Finally, another quote from David there. We need to recognise, and this takes a bit of the pressure off us, that MedAct is not the solution, but it might be part of the solution.
Thank you all very much indeed. It sounds like everybody had a really interesting time, and I'm sure it's going to be hugely helpful to David and the board in taking all this forward. Does 1 minute? Does anybody have anything that they desperately want to say has been left out? Right. Yes. We're going on now, but before I just finish this session, just two quite practical things. One is there's a pair of brown leather gloves. If anybody's lost them, they're down there. The second is a very brief message from our treasurer. Will you kindly all look in your packs and find this pamphlet? If you're not a member of MedAct, will you please fill it in and join? And if you are a member of MedAct, will you please take it home and give it to a friend? Having said that, can I now invite Jackie Davis from the NHS Consultants Association? And after Jackie, David McCoy is going to share with us his first ideas on how we move forward from this, and that will end the conference. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for inviting me, I think. I've been asked to make a housekeeping announcement, which David didn't want to make, so I've been volunteered. There's a bucket outside the door, and you're asked to give generously, and in the same way that armies march on their stomach, campaigns march on their donations. So please, it was felt that this was a very good value meeting if you could give whatever you can. Somebody said, I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm really thrilled to be here. I just wish I wasn't up on the podium, actually, because I feel as though I'm following this fantastic day, which I've got to sum up somehow in a rather short time. And I think if I'd known the size of the audience and the quality of the audience, I might not have been quite so quick to accept the invitation. Richard Horton and David both stood up and gave their credentials today. Richard as a bit mad on Twitter and David as a bit radical. Well, my credentials I'm very proud of, that Max Hastings in the Daily Mail recently named me as a rabble-rouser, and I think that's rather... So my remit is to round up the meeting and send us away eager to take action. And what I wrote down here was that for many of us to take action, we need to overcome inertia and to some extent fear. And the best way is to make us angry. Now, having listened to what's gone on in this room today, I don't sense any inertia, I don't sense much fear, and I do sense a lot of anger. So I'm going to skip that bit and go straight on to talk a little bit about the NHS, and that's definitely my campaigning background. I'm not an academic, I'm a jobbing radiologist. I've worked in the NHS for many decades now. And I think what's happened to the NHS is a paradigm for what's happening to many of the things that we're worried about at the moment. We've taken a successful public service. It's being subjected to massive ideological reorganisation at the moment, at the same time as unprecedented financial cuts. And I just looked up some figures this morning. Nurses cut nearly 6,000, beds cut 8,000, any performance the worst for 8 years, NHS up for sale, 12 billion out in contracts to the private sector at the moment. And at the same time, we've got the disgraceful bullying of NHS staff and the scapegoating of migrants for the problems that are inevitably happening in the NHS at the moment. And while the politicians are running it down, they're accusing it of failing. This is the double whammy that's happening to the NHS at the moment. But of course, all this is intended to cause the failure of the NHS as we know it, because quite frankly, a successful public service is an affront to the neoliberal spibs, and they simply can't stand seeing a public service that the public love. So what we're seeing at the moment is scorched earth policy enacted by this government that fears, with good reason, that it won't be in power for much longer. And they're pushing laws through, which will mean that there's not much of the NHS left by the time their term ends. And at this stage, they really don't care what we think about it. Hunt, for example, lost his case against Lewisham. I'm sure a lot of you followed that. And his response has been not to say I got it wrong, but that I'm going to change the law so that I don't have to listen to you in future. That is how arrogant this government is. I'm just going to hold this up. I managed to sell all the copies but this today. I'm not an academic. This is probably the only book I'm ever going to be associated with. It is NHS SOS, Who Betrayed the NHS and How We Can Save It. And I'm holding it up because somebody said, I'm not going to buy it because I think we've lost it. And my message, one of my messages to you today is we have not lost the NHS. I haven't got time to tell you how we can save it, but Alison mentioned it briefly. You know, David Owen's law, we need the NHS as preferred provider. Do not give up on the NHS. We haven't lost it. And if you want to know how they've trashed it and how to save it, do buy our book. I don't get anything out of this. The profits go to our campaign. I'll move on to a broader front, because what's happened is that the social contract, which came out after the last war, with its promise of security and stability and social fairness, is no longer considered a legitimate social goal. And I think that's a real problem for us as a society. And instead, we've seen a return to extremes of private privilege in this country, public squalor, and more inequality than we've ever had since the 1920s, I'm told. And we know that what matters is not how affluent a country is, but how unequal it is, and that inequality is corrosive. It rots society from within. It's not only morally wrong, but it leads to social evils, and we can't address those social evils unless we address the inequality itself. So it's easy to lose heart at the moment faced with all these things because, you know, quite frankly, what we're looking at is the corporate capture of democracy. Democracy is up for sale, and it's very easy to get depressed at that prospect. The political class has aligned itself, I like the phrase somebody used this morning, has cozied up to corporations, and it's obliging social institutions like the NHS to behave as though they were businesses, with economic efficiency as the only criterion. And the organisations that should have been in the first line of defence have let us down. Trade unions, I'm sorry to say, have been conspicuous by their silence, and the Labour Party under Blair continued Tory policies, as we know, of deregulation and privatisation. There is a political vacuum with no one representing the interests of people rather than big business. And quite frankly, the NHS needs the Labour Party that created it, not the one that we've got at the moment. One conundrum is that no one can seriously claim they believe in the perfect free market anymore because it's conspicuously failed. But the neoliberal agenda did not collapse along with the global financial market. In fact, the political power of transnational firms has been enhanced by delivering public services to them and by the fact that they proved too large to fail during the financial collapse. And that has made them, if anything, more arrogant and more impregnable. And the irony is that the financial crisis was due to the banks and financial institutions, but the solutions apparently are to cut back the welfare state and to cut back public spending. So what can the individual do when faced with what Colin Crouch, I don't know whether any of you know his book, The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. It's a very, very good book. I recommend that. He calls the cosy accommodation between the state, the market, and the corporation. What can individuals do? I think the first answer is that we don't have to act as individuals, and that's why organisations like my own, Keep Our NHS Public, and MedAct are really important because they allow us to get together, meet nice people, and to overcome that inertia and fear that there is if you try to act alone. But even when we're organised, we face huge challenges at the moment. One is to recognise the big picture, which has very much come out today about corporate capture of the world, while not losing hope that we can do something about it. So I think we need to think globally and act locally. I went to a very good talk by the Dalai Lama once who was talking about compassion, and he said, do good little by little. Don't do nothing because you can't do everything. And I think that should be something that's true for us. But because we can't take it all on, sometimes it's not just down to MedAct. We should do what we can. And how can we engage the younger generation in politics when our politicians behave in a way which leads to cynicism and brings politics into disrepute? And the other challenge for us is to get the message outside this room, because we are a bunch of committed activists here. I just want to look a little bit about how I think the left has lost its way, and this is again from Tony Judd, whose book Ill Fares the Land is an excellent analysis of why the left has the moral argument but keeps losing the practical fight. Because we've become fragmented. It's a classical problem of the left, and we've lost our sense of shared purpose, and we've become apologetic and defensive. I think we need to find our voice and not be ashamed to make demands and to talk about shared aspirations. We need to apologise less and talk more about our social achievements. We've all grown up with the security of the welfare state and benefited from healthcare and education and assumed upward social mobility. And I think our casual acceptance of it now has led to our failure to protect it. We need to challenge the assumptions that public services and progressive taxation are bad, while it's acceptable that banks are too big to fail and that people are reading all our emails. Tony Judd concluded his book with a passionate appeal for a return to social democratic ideals, by which I think he meant that we reclaim our role as citizens and we become the fourth force lined up against this unholy triangle of the market and the supranational corporations and the politicians. So social democracy can be loosely described as a belief in collective action for collective good, acting together for a common purpose. And when we organise ourselves for the common benefit, examine how to reduce these inequalities, and rejoice in society and collective aspirations. We recognise the importance of moral purpose in human affairs. You know, there's no moral quality to political debate anymore. Why do we always value efficiency over compassion? We need to take that language back, and we need to be proud of it and not ashamed of it. We need to challenge the prevailing idea of a society in which the pursuit of material self-interest is a virtue. We need to state there are public goods and goals for which the market is not suited, and that private profit doesn't always lead to public good. And we need to remind people it wasn't always the case that the point of life was to get rich, and the point of the government was to help us to do that. One of the casualties of the prevailing ethos is the welfare state. The welfare state protects the weak majority from the strong and privileged minority, the famous 1%, who, however much they've got, it's never enough. And finally, what we all need to do is to get angry and to go away and organise to confront this. And, you know, the point of this is to make you angry and to think that you can go away and do something about it. To finish, I'm just going to come back to health and the NHS. You know, it's an absolute scandal, the whole privatisation agenda. We know it doesn't work. It privatises the profit while it socialises the risk. But also, moving public ownership to the private sector allows the state to relinquish its moral obligations. And we already see this with the health service. No one is in charge anymore. Anyone but the government is to blame, and the state has abandoned its function here. Social purpose and coherence is lost, and society is reduced to disconnected individuals with their individual choices, which of course is how we've been sold all of this, just as Mrs. Thatcher described when she wickedly said that there was no such thing as society. I'm going to quote a few of my heroes now. Bevan, if you haven't read Bevan's In Place of Fear, it's a wonderful book. It's as relevant today as it was when he wrote it then. He said two things which I think we should always have at the front of our minds. Medical care is a communal responsibility, available to rich and poor alike, according to medical need and no other criteria. No society, are you listening, Obama and the rest of you, can legitimately call itself civilized if a sick person is denied medical aid because of lack of means. These are wonderful words, but words are no longer enough because of the forces that we're up against. And as philosophers said, you know, they've interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. So I come to Orwell, another hero. There's no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues now. So we need, as somebody said this morning, to repoliticize our thinking. And then finally we come to Dante. I thought you need a bit of culture at the end of the day. Dante reserved the lowest circle of hell for those who were morally neutral. And John F. Kennedy liked that idea, and he used to paraphrase it. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in time of moral crisis, preserve their neutrality, the compromisers who fail to show moral courage. This is a time of moral crisis, and we need to be showing that moral courage and leading by example, because if not us, the health professionals who are trusted by the public, then who is going to do it? So I welcome this rebirth of MedAct as part of that movement, and I think it's really important. So here are the final take-home messages that I got today. Don't underestimate the power of our organised citizens' voice. Use data and science to change politics, and monitor these bastards. Monitor them, because that's how we know what's going on, and it's very, very important. Have hope and courage. We've opened Pandora's box, if you like. We must see at the bottom that we can do something about this, and have hope and courage that activism can change things. And I like very much what Cam Stock said today. Capture the undercurrent of rage and dissatisfaction that could be really it's like steam that is not being directed anywhere. This younger generation have got it. Capture their imagination, and let's get them working for us. And above all, don't let this fizzle out. Thank you.
Okay, I think I should be congratulated for having asked Jackie to do the closing talk. I want to do two things. First of all, I want to say thank you to a number of people. In particular, I want to thank Victor Ponsford and Chris Venables. I don't know if you're around, but they have been amazing organisers of this day. And ably assisted by a whole group of volunteers. I'd also like to thank Eddie McCaffrey and his film crew. Eddie emerged out of nowhere and came up with an idea of filming today's event. And I think that will prove to be incredibly useful in sharing some of the discussion we've had with people who haven't been here. A whole number of people on the board of MedAct have been working hard to make this event happen. And finally, I want to thank all the speakers who have agreed to lose a Saturday to talk to us, to be part of this discussion. So with that, maybe a round of applause for all of those people. So MedAct is officially relaunched, but the relaunch of MedAct doesn't end today. It's a 4-month, maybe a 5-month relaunch. And I want to emphasize this point. It's not enough to just have this conference, as was mentioned this morning. What will happen over the next 3, 4, 5 months will be a series of events, meetings, workshops, discussions about how we actually organize ourselves and how we plan a program of work for MedAct. And that the program of work for MedAct must include MedAct's own work, it must include a degree of fundraising, it must include a mobilization of the wider health community, and it needs to include the development of linkages, alliances, and partners with other organizations. So that's going to be happening over the next 4 or 5 months. So don't feel that the discussion this afternoon is all that's going to be leading up to a set of recommendations about what we do next. This afternoon's discussion was merely a starting point. You're all invited to be part of that thinking and part of that shaping of MedAct's evolution and development. And we'll be posting up information on our website about how we're going to take these next steps forward. Another thing that we're going to be producing is a report that brings together the interconnectedness of the crises that we talked about this morning. I think there is a need for a holistic analysis, a need for being able to join up the dots between the different health threats that currently exist, and a need to then put forward an alternative vision that will be parts of a coherent response to these individual and different crises. So that's something that we will try and produce in the next 3 months. And anyone who wants to be involved with the finalization and production of that report, please let us know. And the final thing is that I hope you had fun. I did. I felt that there was a lot of energy in all the rooms that I was in. So final thanks to all of you for coming and participating, and I hope that this is just the beginning and not the end of our discussions. Thank you very much.
Yes.